Shuffle is a 2005 anime adaptation of a visual novel by the same name. The anime did decently well in Japan, garnering enough attention to later receive a recap series, and in the West received a good quality dub, however has since faded into obscurity, becoming the sort of show that long-time anime fans might suggest to you that is unlikely to come up in general discussion. This lack of staying power, combined with a somewhat mixed reception in the West, has left the show in a somewhat unknown position. Few reviews of any real merit in video or essay format exist, and most of the ones that do spend large amounts of time being somewhat ironically butthurt that their favourite waifu didn't win. Or my favourite review on Mal, which somehow has the most likes for the series, explaining how the show is bad because Rin is indecisive, and in doing so completely missing the entire point of the show. But I digress. Taking all this into consideration, I think it's high time someone, amateur or otherwise, wrote a half-competent review and analysis of the property. Unfortunately, I'm the only person available. It's a property which I personally think is one of the best in its genre, nay, the Evangelion of the harem high school visual novel genre. Try saying that 3 times in a row. Shuffle as an anime, which is all we'll be addressing here, is packed with layers of visual storytelling, animation abuse, and fantasy metaphors for real-life illnesses. Its topics as it's first and foremost a cleverly written and entertaining harem rom-com, but secondly is a fascinating deconstruction of the genre it belongs to. It isn't afraid to call out its audience on topics as delicate as Lolitas, yanderes, and even the time-honoured best girl debate. It's received unsurprising levels of flack for these bold moves, from people who hate its intentionally flawed main characters, to others who think a yandere with a serious codependency mental illness deserves to win the day. On the other end of the spectrum, you have those who write the whole show off as soap opera crap, with forced drama and conflict. For this essay, I'd like to stand in Shuffle's corner and fight its side of the debate, hopefully without getting tangled up in the semantics of preferable 2D fictional girls and the merits of wish-fulfillment characters too much. Writing this actually proved to be somewhat difficult as to how to divide up the various strands of the show and the ridiculous layers of depth that can be daunting. As such, I'll divide this into segments or arcs and cover characters as we go along in further depth. To anyone still reading this who hasn't seen Shuffle yet, now's your time to bail, as heavy spoilers are ahead, but take my word on it, and go watch Shuffle with an open mind. Give it the benefit of the doubt, and you might just be pleasantly surprised. I'm aware my usual reviews have a more detailed spoiler-free segment, but on this occasion all that needs to be said is that it gets my highest of recommendations. If you're unconvinced after watching it, feel free to come back here and read the rest of this retrospective, and if you're still unconvinced after that, shoot me a message and let me know why. Without further ado, let's get to the main topic. Arc 1. The Fairy Tale Arc, episodes 1 through 11. You can divide Shuffle's 24-episode run into multiple different ways, either by character or plot, but for the sake of this essay we'll call episodes 1 through 11 the Fairy Tale Arc, 12 through 16 the Awakening Arc, and 17 to 21 Honest Feelings. Finally, episodes 22 to 24 is the Redemption Arc, or the smallest part. These titles are by no means official, but should make it easier to categorise the various episodes as we go along. So keeping on topic, the Fairy Tale Arc is a somewhat self-explanatory name. In the interest of this not becoming one of those monotonous recap reviews, I'll try to keep story breakdowns short where possible. The first arc rapidly introduces us to the world of our characters, the world of our story and its characters. Based in a small Japanese city, it becomes quickly apparent most of the settings parallels our own real world, but that after an unknown event, the walls between Earth and what is essentially heaven and hell have weakened, allowing for travel and commerce between the 3 worlds. As such, we find ourselves in a typical educational setting, except where humans, gods and demons, plus hybrid combinations therein, all attend the generic high school anime. This, in true harem fashion, is all conveyed in quick succession within the first episode, and clearly left vague for the sake of mimicking other shows in the genre, retaining a sense of mystery. While the world of Shuffle is generally pretty fleshed out, it is seldom the focus. Instead, that is always on the characters. In fact, even the intro song goes to great lengths to reinforce this fact, with its opening on a close-up of each girl, followed by shots of the town deserted with no vocals in the background, to effectively communicate at the start of every episode that this is a story all about people, not places, but more on the title song later. Moving from this, we're introduced to our lead players. Over the course of the first 2 episodes, Asa Character, Nerine, Litiantus, or Sia, Primila, Keade and Rin Tsuchimi. There is also a number of decently fleshed out side characters, but again, if you've not seen the series and you've read down this far, I'd once more advise you finish the show and then come back, as this is about as much exposition as I'm going to be giving out. All that table dressing out of the way, let's get down to it. As mentioned, the Fairy Tale Arc generally requires the least to understand. This isn't to suggest it's any less layered than the rest, but instead that this arc is intentionally written to give the show a solid foundation and set up each of its cast members. The brilliantly natural drama of the show's second core can only function as well as it does due to the legwork put in by this first arc. The arc also does a marvellous job of foreshadowing for future events, which can make rewatches of said episodes feel like an Easter egg hunt, as you try to spot all the telltale signs the show lays out to hint at its true directions and intent. I won't spend too much time on the episodes of the first arc, as I'm sure I'll reference them in more detail during the specific character breakdowns. However, I will draw a few scenes to your attention now, as I feel it helps better with understanding character themes we'll be referencing a lot later. Episode 4, Egg Omelette of Happiness. Within this episode we get a microcosm of what's to come. During it we see Nerine attempt to learn to cook an omelette for Reen to show him her affections. Straight away we start to see an interesting transgression in the show's portrayal of archetypes. If you're unaware, Shuffle's characters do actually qualify for the general stereotypes of anime rom-coms. This is more obvious for some than others. For example, Primila's physical appearance makes her the clear Lolita type. Meanwhile, Nerine seems to be the obvious dere at the start of the series, with Asa as the tsundere, Keade the yandere, and Sia as the tomboy, although that's sometimes been called bakadere more recently. However, Nerine straight away shows one of the core beliefs of the show. The characters are people first before their tropes. In Narine's case, we see this in her inability to bake and her somewhat pampered upbringing. Generally, the dere type is highly devoted, often for shaky reasoning. A great cook, a competent homemaker, of a quiet disposition, and usually will be the least aggressive of the harems, of the girls in the harem. But like we said, the whole episode's premise revolves around Nerine not being able to cook, and we see on multiple occasions that she's hopeless at housework. None of this is to say Nerine isn't a dere, but to simply reinforce the fact that the show, in each of its character premises, is already going against standard anime conventions. Now, with those traits in mind, let's go back to episode 4, where we see Nerine in the cooking club room attempting to cook. She cuts herself with a kitchen knife, only for Asa to enter the room. She immediately produces a plaster from her pocket and helps out Nerine with her cut finger. After some quick consoling, Nerine asks for tutoring. In the following 10 seconds, the show manages to tell us everything we need to know about both characters in a matter of frames. Asa shows herself to be an experienced chef at home in the kitchen, and even more important are her motherly tendencies. Despite only being vaguely acquaintances at this stage in the story, Asa immediately goes to help, and furthermore carries plasters, clearly for similar accidents with other underclassmates, and we know she at least taught Keade, rather than plasters for herself. Meanwhile, Nerine is shown to be reserved and shy, and willing initially to ask for help, almost prideful. She's somewhat naive in her thinking, and clearly a little clumsy. This goes further thanks to their clothing. As we'll talk about more as we go on, clothing is often used to show development, or as a literary shorthand throughout the story. Here it's quickly used to establish the duo's relationship with the kitchen, and to reflect parts of their personalities. Narine's apron is a girly pink and frilly. I'd go as far as saying it's ill-fitting. It reminds us of her status as a princess and her baking ineptitude. Meanwhile, Asa wears a plain, green, well-fitted apron with no frills in sight. Aside from being colour-coded to her hair, it represents her level-headed, no-nonsense attitude and practical, motherly nature. This is wonderful visual characterization. The first arc is full of subtle moments like these that help to further develop and make for sufficient short-form character growth. We could talk about these at length, but the point in hand is to illustrate how the show, with quiet visual cues and minimal dialogue, conveys its character traits and habits in a natural way, which seems a far cry from more modern anime's blunter approach. Putting this short scene aside, the episode also has another scene that greatly helps to illuminate another important staple of Shuffle, its double-ended foreshadowing. This comes at the end of the episode, where Nerine reconfirms her devotion to Rin, and is seemingly the obvious conclusion of the episode, except as becomes apparent later on. The scene takes on a whole new meaning after it's echoed in episode 15. When Nerine says, "Is it okay if I fall in love with you?" she's essentially realising for the first time her own feelings, as up until now, she's simply been pursuing Rin out of a survivor's guilt complex towards her twin clone sister Lycoris. Well, we can't know this on the first time around. This line acts as an early clue that the Nerine we know isn't all she seems. This is further compounded by the fact that Sia constantly references her childhood memories of Rin. Meanwhile, Nerine comparatively rarely does this, and while this initially seems due to her disproportionate screen time, on a rewatch this line makes far more, almost tragic sense. This first arc is littered with foreshadowing like that to come. Another example of both the above topics from episode 4 presents itself in episode 9. Survival at the beach. Here we see what will soon become standard fare for Rin. While believing himself and Sia to be stranded offshore and under attack by a wild animal, Rin offers in an altruistic fashion to stay behind and buy Sia time to run away. On the surface, this seems like the right thing to do, and you'd be forgiven for initially thinking as such. However, the prevailing theme of Rin's arc is that doing what seems socially right, rather than what's actually best for a person in question, isn't always for the best. We'll see this in far more important ways during the Awakening and Honest Feelings arcs, but Rin's short-sighted thinking is a reoccurring cause of hurt for the whole cast. Using the example as outlined above, what would Keade do if she did run? Ankle injured and seemingly marooned on some desert island. Without Rin, her chances of survival seem slim, but then, emotionally speaking, she would surely be distraught. And the real important thing is actually neither of those two factors. Rin's self-sacrifice idea is bad because it's not what Sia wants. She wants to be with him, whether that's deserted on an island or to die to some terrible wild beast. All she wants from him is companionship, which, in the moment, Rin can't see. That's far from all that could be said about episode 9. The fact alone that Rin and Sia temporarily find themselves in an Adam and Eve situation, while a heavenly choir sings in the background, is probably worth a more detailed discussion. But for our purposes, this is the first example of Rin's misplaced altruism and is an important feature of the episode. Aside from that, there isn't too much to draw particular attention to in the show's opening act that we won't bring up later in more depth when we look at each character. I'd be remiss not to mention, at least, that the first 8 episodes wonderfully display... I'd be remiss not to at least mention the first 8 episodes' wonderful display of a short arc for each character. Episode 11's well-placed comedic break for background characters as well. And, of course, anime's best long-running joke, the KKK, not the guys in the sheets, the Knights of Keade, who are rather appropriately phrased out more and more in the second act as the show's tone begins to darken. One final note on the first act, for the time being, would be to mention the show's use of the traditional Japanese family unit. As the whole arc revolves around setting up an idyllic world where you, the stand-in protagonist, is surrounded by attractive girls and magic as well as fun, wacky adventures, we also have a family unit to add to that fantasy, Keade and Primila, who become a comfortable stand-in for Rin's adoring housewife and well-mannered daughter. The show paints the trio expertly in an almost make-believe young family, while always making sure to use enough Dutch camera angles and cutaway shots to remind us how unrealistic this found family is. This comes to a head in the aptly named Episode 6, Smile. This episode is Primila's spotlight moment, like Episode 4 was for Nerine. It revolves around exploring this newfound family dynamic and starts to hint at Primila's true nature. Primila is an interesting one, and we'll discuss her far more when addressing Arc 2 and even Arc 3, but it should suffice to say her deadpan archetype is a mirror for Ruri Hoshino, who, in turn, pays homage to Rei Ayanami, who is, well, you get the picture. Like in those shows, and long before the likes of Heaven's Lost Property would repopularize it, the episode revolves around Primila's lack of emotions and inability to smile. I must say it's one of the show's strengths that they get past this part of her character so quickly, and don't feel the need to linger on the smiling thing for too long. And while it's most probably a coincidence, this being episode 6 is the same episode in which Evangelion's Rei first smiles, but once more I digress. This episode also heavily features Keade, and Rin, but that's the case for all the episodes except 11, which is logical considering her surrogate mother status. Keade in these early episodes more accurately fits the childhood friend or dere archetypes better than any other, though we will see fairly frequent foreshadowing of her impending breakdown, especially in some of the rather chilling scenes during episode 5 and 10. All in all, though, we'll address her more in her own arc, as her role is mostly secondary in episode 6. As I mentioned, this episode deals with Primila. First off, showing us some brilliantly simple choreography, where during school hours we see that Primila essentially wanders Rin-Keade's home as though she were little more than a ghost. Quick cuts start with a skewed top-down view of Primila walking towards the camera, looking minuscule in the house's large porch area. They move to a short montage of shots showing her moving along hallways in the kitchen. The lack of music in the stationary camera lends these scenes an eerie feeling as it becomes increasingly clear what the show is trying to say. When Rin and Keade aren't home, there's no funny comedy skit or secret hobby that Primila takes part in. She just exists, like a doll or a lingering spirit. She simply just stops being relevant without the presence of others. The show further hammers this home when we see Primila aimlessly channel hopping on the TV, her reflection prevailing through the images of flamboyant Japanese daytime programming. The shows are hollow, devoid of soul, man-made for a shallow purpose, simply thoughtless entertainment. And then she turns off the TV. And the shot lingers for an uncomfortably long length on her face's reflection on the screen. If you still haven't picked up the metaphor, the show has one more image in its toolbox, as it shows Primila playing with her cat doll, its head held up in front of her so that the sunlight shines through the window on it. It's illuminated while she's covered in the shadows of the dimly lit room. The light on the doll is representative of how Primila To her it means love, her only keepsake of Lycoris, or anyone for that matter, while meanwhile her being in the dark reminds us, at least on rewatches, that she's unnatural, inhuman, and unloved. She stares at the doll like an imaginary friend, or not as like an imaginary friend, but as though she expects it to prove her existence, all tying into her character's theme of neglect. Following this, we get a somewhat controversial set of scenes, including a partially nude Primila and a laundry shopping scene. There's actually a lot that can be talked about here, and in terms of the morality and appropriateness of the scene, we'll talk in greater detail on that when we address the show's theme of maturity and nudity. Catchy little title. But to give some surface level thoughts and clarifications on it, Primila is not a lolly, at least not in the modern or traditional senses of the word. By the end of the show, she has become one, but especially in the show's early stages, she clearly is meant to be a child first and foremost, and as such, Rin repeatedly expresses a lack of interest in her romantically. Even after episode 15, this doesn't seem to change much at all. The lingerie shopping scene is really quite mundane, and by anime standards, markedly tame. Additionally, the idea of people dressing kids up as mini-me's is by no means exclusive to Japan, and if anything, is used to show how much of an outsider Primula is to the group, and how uninterested or non-understanding she is by the whole affair. All told, it works with some cheap laughs as well as playing an appropriate story function, so I can't really see how you can draw much issue with it unless you've never watched any other anime with a token Lolita before. Again, I don't want to get bogged down on it, but as far as braless Primula in the Rain, I think it's really important to acknowledge how the scene is highly important to the narrative. From a few seconds of a flash and Rin's reaction, not embarrassment for seeing her breasts, but shame for not considering his standard daughter's needs, we better learn a lot about both characters. We learn Primila has an almost childlike understanding of relationships, gender, sexuality, and even common sense clothing etiquette. As stated, for Rin, it reinforces how Primila isn't an object of similar sexual desire. It shows his integrity or maturity, and it shows us just how out of his depth Rin really is when it comes to trying to raise a child at such a young age. Could this have been communicated differently? Of course. Simply have Keade or ask Primila to try on one of her old t-shirts while Rin is sitting watching TV. Primila could comply immediately, switching off her current top in a nonchalant manner, revealing her undisclosed chest, which to the audience would be obscured by a chair or Rin's now flustered face, and a funny scene could ensue with Keade and Rin lambasting each other, or Primila for not addressing this earlier. Would that or something similar carry the same weight and that quiet sense of nuance? Probably not. And that's something that becomes reoccurring in Shuffle. Raw storytelling through nudity, natural drama, or heartfelt, honest dialogue is how the show operates. As I first mentioned, we'll go into more detail on this later, but the show never gives us call to think these scenes are done with lustful intent, and I think Shuffle more than deserves the benefit of the doubt. The episode concludes with Rin gifting Primila a replacement stuffed cat doll. Aside from some fun jokes mixed in, like Keade fainting twice, or the nyandam, the resolution scene is sweet and rather straightforward. Rin gives Primila the cat, which for Primila symbolises love, and not some twisted meaning of the word, but instead it in its most base form, the sort one feels towards a sibling or parent. This familial love is ironically one of the only emotions Primila seems to have a true grasp on, and thanks to Lycoris demonstrating it to her with the first cat plushie. This is enough to further her and Rin's bond and close the episode out on a smile. In Rin's own words to Itsuki, your ability to turn something innocent into something obscene amazes me. Episode 6 alludes to and overall helps explore the dynamic of Shuffle's fanciful family unit, something Clanad would later more famously go on to do in more detail a few years later, albeit in a different style. Episode 12 would be the start of the end for this make-believe scenario. It should be noted that if Shuffle was just an 11-episode harem, it would still be above average, but overall, generally serviceable show. But with the changes alluded to in Ep 10 and hammered home in 12, we move into the second arc and the real heart of the story. With all our preamble and setup over the first arc done now, we can really get to what makes this show so great. The Awakening, Arc 2, episodes 12 to 16. Unlike Arc 1, the title I've taken to using for Arc 2 is a little more opaque. In essence, Shuffle's second arc revolves around acknowledging our personal shortcomings, and to accept that life isn't a fairy tale. We were shown this through Narine's survivor's guilt, Primila's harsh reality, Sia's self-worth insecurities, and Rin's naivete in believing he could live in a fairy tale scenario forever, without hurting anyone in the process. Unlike Arc 1, from here on we'll be looking at things in a more episodic manner, rather than on the broad stroke basis, and with a finer comb for the details of an individual scene. With that short intermission out of the way, let's address the impending end of summer. Episode 12, Frozen Summer. Frozen Summer sees our new familiar gang of characters going about a fairly unremarkable day. It's the end of summer, and as such, Rin, Sia and Nerine are working on completion of holiday homework, while Keade and Primila go about more mundane housework chores. All this seems to be in order, but from the get-go the show drops two small hints of what's to come. There's the most obvious one, which comes when we see Primila pouring a cup of tea, only for said tea to momentarily crystallise. It's a brief affair. A second later, the tea returns to water, with little more than Primila's expression to prove it even happened. Interestingly, on watching this scene blank for a first time, one would be forgiven for thinking this would be the start of a setup for a generic anime arc where the young character loses confidence in her natural magical abilities, only for the protagonist to help them out and the two to grow a little closer in the process. But Shuffle has other plans. Further implant this idea of a standard light-hearted anime arc, we get the second hint scene. This one's a little less apparent and almost seems out of character for both Rin and the property, but while studying with Nerine and Sia, we see Rin become aroused and make a pervy face in reaction to some fan service. To me, this scene stands out so much that it was clearly intentional. As aforementioned, it initially disarms us into thinking this episode will be a repeat of episode 11's lighter, more comical and fan-servicey tone. Furthermore, though, it serves to show how comfortable Rin has gotten in his daily life. The original troubles and issues that arose of suddenly finding oneself with a gang of female groupies have mostly been resolved. His surrogate family is running along smoothly, and he's enjoying the summer of his youth. In showing terms, this is Rin letting his guard down to disastrous effect. Moreover, we now start to see episode 12's wonderful use of literary shorthand. Firstly, in terms of simple characterization, it makes logical sense to see Sia and Rin as the two least prepared for the new school term. Additionally, that Keade is the most ready in advance, but putting this surface level observation aside, the show makes further use of its usual parallel storytelling. We'll talk more about this in greater detail later, but for the moment it should be noted that Rin's study group consists of the other worlds as Sia and Nerine. These two contrast and parallel each other in ways the show likes to use, and it highlights moments that are fantastical or unrealistic, like for example the very scene we're discussing. The two have the most unnatural hair colours to help them stand out, and Sia in particular is by far the most fan-servicey character in the show. So as mentioned, all this builds up to disarm the audience alongside Rin in preparation for what's to come. It might also be worth noting that Primila is not in this scene. This also may seem like a given, but she doesn't attend school yet, nor is she considered a member of the harem till about episode 22. But with her running team of neglect, it's always interesting to see the show make an effort to separate her from the other worlders of the group. In comes one of my favourite scenes in all of anime, for its brilliant use of literary shorthand and simplistic but effective visuals. Cast your mind back to the stage. Primila basked in the summer rays, stands watering sunflowers, among other plants, in the Kikyou residential garden. She seems content, and why not? She's found a family, a place to belong, and has even started taking an interest in interacting with life, as evidenced by the plant, which Rin later implies that Primila planted and nurtured of her own volition. And then it happens. It's been a long time in the making. We've been told magic can be unstable, volatile, as evidenced by Nerine, and we've had foreshadowing aplenty to indicate Primila being something more than a normal demon. Well, as normal as you can when talking fantasy, at least. And so in a matter of moments, we watch a circle of ice spiral out from Primila, enveloping the whole garden, all of her work, and rendering her unconscious. But to put it that simply is to do it a major disservice, so let's break this down a little more thoroughly. First off, we see the hose Primila is wielding. It ejects ice rather than water. This immediately frightens her and she lets go of the hose almost involuntarily, in much the same way as is happening with her powers. It rides violently, employing snake-like imagery, which should come as relevant considering the show's use of religious iconography. Before we move to a close-up of her, as a cruel white light emits out from the ground under her, and here's the first big instance of shorthand. The image subconsciously brings out an idea of bedwetting, further added to by Primila's childish get-up, dungarees, pigtails and all. In a lesser show this might come across as perverse, but in Shuffle's case it's used to subtly implant the idea of a loss of control in the minds of the viewer. She doesn't actually wet herself, but rather the image implies it. If a child wets the bed, it's frowned upon, and if a younger teenager still does it, they'd be seen as immature, maybe taken to a doctor, something that presently happens to Primila. There's no moment where Primila or anyone else in the scene has to convey the fact she's lost control. Far too often in anime, characters will explain what's going on in any given moment or battle, but here, with the simple use of her expression and the visual bedwetting metaphor, all the information we need is seamlessly communicated without any dialogue whatsoever in the entire scene. But it's not done yet. For one, let's talk about the choice of magic the writer uses. In the case of all other magic was shown in the show, it's just vague explosions, particle effects, and the like. But Primula seemingly quite deliberately uses some form of ice magic. The use of the cold blue tone acts as a further shorthand as it brings to mind the numbing, cruel, and lonely sensation and emotions that modern media has come to associate with ice. Rounding out the scene, as already mentioned, we witness the flowers Primula poured her time into freeze to ice, along with the garden, patio door, and with a specific focus on both the sunflowers and a shattering cicada. Now, here we have a few more things of significance, but subtle note. Flowers and sunflowers in particular are used as a theme of sorts throughout the show, as we'll discuss in greater detail later. But it should be clear to most that the freezing helps to represent summer ending at Primila's hand in an unnatural, unplanned way, and another of the running themes of Primila being her unnatural nature. It should also be pointed out that while flowers are often used to represent how the girls are in the bloom of their youth, Primila is stagnant. She isn't a fully fledged person like the others. She has quite literally stopped blossoming, of both the flowers and herself. This even extends to her depiction during the intro song. The shattering cicada is a fairly anime or Japanese-centric piece of imagery. Anyone who's experienced the like of Kagura Project or Higurashi will already be aware of the broad range of symbolism these noisy creatures are often used for. Here the shattering initially serves to convey the end of summer, same as the frozen sunflowers, but it goes a step further, acting as foreshadowing towards the lethal nature of Primila's magic. It lets us know straight away that there's a chance for her to hurt those around herself, and with hindsight represent how her magic may well be deadly to herself too. On our primary analysis of this scene, its use of visual metaphors and shorthand, let's come back to her ice magic again, as well as the whole result of the frozen garden, or summer if you like. Something else we can interpret as the scene telling us is the unique nature of Primila. As stated, primarily that she's not natural, a construct of some sort, but we get it more than that. The scene helps to reinforce the idea that Primila is something dangerous, almost weapon-like, something to be wary of and cautious toward. The frozen garden of plants she tried to grow inspires sickening imagery of failed life, as though Primila constitutes infertility, an inability to feel emotions or to be human, an inability to lead a normal life, and someone who can never give life. It's some pretty heavy stuff, and the show doesn't ever try to address it head-on, but instead through the use of its metaphors and in quiet, subtler ways. Bedrooms. On we move to Primila's room. Straight off the bat, there's some nice parallels to be drawn between her room and that of the other characters, and this is also an appropriate time to address the use of bedrooms in the show as a whole. It's by no means unique, and something of a favourite of mine to see in anime. Each room in Shuffle tells us a little something or other about the characters who inhabit it. As we go along, we'll dip into more detail on this, but to be brief. His room is dominated by her mirror, for obvious reasons, as well as being neater than we might expect from the resident airhead, an effect of her being the housekeeper, no doubt. Keade's room is much more empty. Will be important when talking about Primila, but soon, but to summarise, this clearly represents her total reliance on Rin. She has no hobbies outside of looking after him, and no need for excess amounts of clothing unless it specifically helps her in her unhealthy goal to please Rin. Asa's room is chock full of two things: clothes and stuffed toys, along with a tidy little work study table. This rather nicely tells us that she's got far more hobbies and likes to be interested in than the other girls. She takes a proper interest in cooking and fashion, and as for the stuffed animals, they act both to accentuate her less tomboyish side and to remind us of how much she's lost to her illness. In a sense, some of her room is still stuck or held back in the past, so despite it showing her greater number of interests in daily life, it's also a bittersweet reminder of her ever-present disability. So then, did Primula simply draw the short straw of the design budget with her barren, blank room? Well, for starters, she hasn't actually been around for that long, only moving in somewhere in the region of maybe 2 to 6 months prior. Still, that's long enough to accumulate some trinkets, especially for a girl her age. No, rather, as mentioned, Primula's room draws some interesting parallels to Keade's. It's empty because of her lack of hobbies or interests. In fact, arguably more so, because where Keade has her unhealthy devotion to Rin, Primila has nothing. She isn't just disconnected from reality, she has no interest in life itself. This is going to help with her characterization as an empty or soulless doll, with the only company she keeps being the 2 cat plushies, which to her are gifts that represent far more than any sentimental toy could. While we're still fresh on the topic of toys and parallels, Primula and Asa's rooms both have a focus on the stuffed animals. Primula because it's all that's in her room, and Asa's because of the sheer quantity. And in both cases there's a good argument to be made that they represent the love of others that have been shown towards them, with it being clear that Asa's plushies are mostly gifts from her mother to comfort her during her sickly childhood, which again mirrors Primula nicely, as she too is ill due to roughly the same reasons, and both teddies represent the short flashes of love she's been shown. Finally, on this elongated tangent, is actually some nice references to Keade's brief stint of sickness. The shots in places are almost identical to when Keade was temporarily bedbound in an earlier episode, with even the same face flannel placed on Primila's forehead. It serves to remind us of that scene, of how that moment affected Rin and Keade, and of how severe that was, due to simply overworking. Now, with the setting out of the way, to steal a phrase, and again he returns from whence he came. In this section we'll be going over the events of episode 12's second half, and the aptly named 13th episode, House of Twilight, starting in Primila's bedroom. As mentioned, we see her condition is clearly very harsh, with the gang crowded around. Something to note immediately is the framing of the scene. Rin and Keade, Primila's surrogate guardians, are constantly framed together, while the other girls are left just out of shot and only shown during panned and wide shots. It's a nice touch to remind us of the family dynamic that we're seeing here, and as already mentioned, while Shuffle is no Clannad, it certainly puts its own spin on that formula during these episodes, with the story going out of its way to portray the trio as a family going through a major crisis. This is further spurred by Rin's expressions of anguish, especially when he clutches the two cat plushies with a look of a helpless, grieving father. Some more interesting framing comes throughout with the use of, or lack thereof, eyes. The most prominent example being when Rin first asks Primila to go home to the demon world. The camera shoots just his mouth, just the hollow words, half an expression. Rin himself is initially hesitant, with a push from Nerine, he breaks down and proclaims While Rin himself is initially hesitant, with a push from Nerine, who breaks down and proclaims she won't lose anyone else, along with advice from both the kings of the demons and the gods, who act up until this point as just goofy father or uncle figures. Rin gives in, he prostrates to Primila and begs her to go home, as we the audience can only watch as she's literally carried away. Before we move too far on from it, small side note is Narine's breakdown itself. This is after all technically Narine's arc too. We'll get more into it shortly. Episode 14 in particular has a greater focus than she has in 12. What I like here is Rin's reaction. It's a small detail, but Rin never outright asks awkward or insensitive questions. This is great, as for one, it's far too common in anime, but secondly, it wouldn't fit into Rin's character. As we learn in greater detail later on, Rin's lost his fair share, and he's the sort who can understand that feeling of loss. As such, he never asks Seo and Narine about their apparent lack of mothers. It never comes up. Nor does he directly inquire about Asa's father. This all adds to the natural sense and feel the drama takes on. It's never forced. This does have a downside for him as a person, though, as he is less aware of Primila and her condition because of it. But in scenes like this, it's great to see Narine say, "I can't lose anyone else," and have Rin simply comfort her, rather than cutting immediately to dramatic backstory time. So getting back on track, we're far from done with episode 12. I did say this was a busy one. Well, we've already touched on the family unit aspects and Rin's grieving father display. We now get into some more of the nitty-gritty of the show, and as well as Rin's character itself. First, let's start with the property's use of fantasy metaphors to tell stories about real-world illness. Primila is probably the most straightforward in this regard. Her illness is a terminal one with no known cure, and little in the way of warning signs. Like a fast-onsetting cancer, Primila is rapidly taken ill, and the only treatments are experimental. This is what makes up the conflict of the arc. If you were terminally ill, and the only treatment was a low-trial cure, only being performed in a foreign country far away from all your friends and newfound family, would you take it? For some, that answer is easy. Many would say the smallest chance is worth a shot, but for others, they may choose to spend their remaining time at home, surrounded by those they love, rather than risk dying alone under a strange ceiling. This is what Primila is facing. Take away the fantasy elements for a moment, replace the demon world for America or Europe, and you're pretty much the same conundrum. Primila herself has already decided. In fact, she probably did a long time ago. A lack of interest in life, the fate of Lycoris and the other test subjects, it would have all culminated in a mindset of little regard for her own life. Her vehement resistance to going back to the demon world isn't spurred by fear or cowardice, but instead by a wish to die with the family she's finally found, a wish which Rin, for all intensive purposes, unwittingly quenches. Primila's developmental journey is an interesting one by any standards. On the one hand, it mirrors Asa's, in that she is essentially not in any need of personal development, but required to overcome an external challenge. However, this isn't quite true, as unlike Asa, she isn't a complete or healthy person, regardless of her illness. This in turn helps her to mirror the others a bit more, and is a large part of her arc is to become a fully fledged person in her own right, something which parallels Sia, Nerine, and Keade. However, it even goes a step further in that she mirrors Rin's arc, so far as his defect doesn't seem wrong on the surface, but is detrimental on a deeper level. One of the reasons I believe Primila is the core of the show is her similarities to each character's progression, but we'll talk more on that later. So speaking of Rin's arc, let's link it back in here. We already talked about it a little when referring to episode 9's beach episode, and it's a story that doesn't really resolve till the end of the series, though it clearly is more apparent during the Awakening arc. Rin is altruistic to a fault. Like in episode 9, he's always ready to do what's right, as it were. Rin sends Primila back to the demon world, not because it's what she wants, not because it's what he wants, but because it's what he's been told is the right thing to do. Just like trying to buy Sia time, or as we'll see later, his extravagant date with Asa, Rin is easily peer-pressured, bending to the whims of what's socially acceptable. Not quite to the point where I'd say he's trying to keep up appearances or anything that vain, but rather in a misguided attempt to help and please all those around him. This adds into what I'll tentatively call one of Shuffle's main themes, deconstruction. I say tentatively, as calling it a theme isn't quite the correct terminology, or an apt use of the etymology, but to categorise Shuffle as a deconstruction or parody genre anime would be equally incorrect. Let's, for those uninitiated, clarify what I mean. A parody anime is one which riffs on and makes light of its inspirations, oftentimes breaking the fourth wall. A well-known example in recent years is Konosuba, an older one might be Martian successor Nadesco. Alternatively, a deconstruction is more concerned with the deliberate breaking down and analysis of a source genre or form of storytelling in order to either expose the flaws of such stories and or in turn tell new stories. The best known recent example of this would probably be Pule Magi Madoka Magica, or just Magica for brevity's sake. Both of these genres can be really interesting in their own right, but I don't feel Shuffle fits in either. Instead, it's telling a well-written genre-specific story, while making use of some deconstructionist techniques to intentionally, and often unintentionally, show the flawed thinking and fantastical escapism of its contemporaries in the same genre. The most famous example of that sort of storytelling would no doubt be the original Neon Genesis Evangelion, which, while you could list it as a deconstruction, is in truth just a really well-written robot and psychological narrative, which through its superb quality ends up unpacking much of the logic of its own genre. A possible exception to all this is School Days, wherein the original story isn't necessarily a deconstruction, but rather a myriad of bad ends, whereas the anime adaptation is almost without doubt a deliberate attempt at harem anime deconstruction. Overall, it should suffice to say that Shuffle is not focused on being a deconstruction, but is happy to show up it and other shows of its nature, and maybe nowhere more so than Rin Tsuchimi. Rin's faulty altruism is clearly an extrapolation of the standard harem protagonist, who conversely are usually selfless individuals, always ready to put themselves on the line for the heroine, or heroines. In Shuffle, we see this mentality questioned as to whether it's all that safe of an idea. So often we see a protagonist solve a female love interest problem for them, or fight on their behalf, but how often do they ask first? Or actually take into consideration the girl's feelings on the matter? Referencing the highest ranked male Shuffle review again, we see a fascinating comment about how Rin fails to help any of the girls. As we'll talk about this topic at some length, this is both the point of his character and a strength of the show. It fascinates me that people would have preferred that the female characters were weak, rather than the strong individuals that are instead presented. In Rin, we see this personality flaw taken forward, and it makes for interesting viewing, especially when you consider it's all informed by his childhood, where he selfishly, and we'll come back to that, lied to Keade to break her out of her mental instability, stroke depressive comatose, only for this decision to have her form a codependency issue towards him in two detrimental ways. However, interestingly enough, this is one of the things I see people count against Shuffle more often than not. I can understand it, at least on a first viewing and without having watched episode 13. One could be forgiven for thinking Rin has done nothing wrong. By sending Primila home, he's risen her chances of survival, just like how fighting off a tiger in episode 9 might have for Sia, or telling Keade he'd always need her in episode 5. It's a continuing theme, and while these decisions might at first seem the right, maybe honourable even, is Rin really asking himself what they want, or more importantly, what's best for them and himself long term? What he wants? If you're one of the many who I've seen here, at least on Mel, who don't understand why Rin's decisions are bad, or some bewildering reason think Keade should have won, ask yourself, would that be a healthy relationship? Is a traditional harem story that overlooks these flaws and has a fairy tale ending with the hero rescuing the girl from a tower better than one which deals with its own hang-ups and asks you as the viewer to think about said flaws and do the same? In any case, in case there's still anyone not quite on board, let me use a popular anecdote. There's always someone weird when you get on a bus. Maybe they talk to themselves or dress strange. If you get on the bus and find that person isn't there, then you're probably that person. If you truly believe that everything which Rin does is for the best, and that Keade should have won the series, then ask yourself this: are you the person Shuffle's talking about? So with all this in mind, we move into episode 13. Primila has been seconded back to the demon world, and the rest of the cast is left to deal with the consequences of this decision. A part of this whole thing, which I love, is the whole level of responsibility presented to us. The penalty Rin receives for prolonging his fantasy family unit is a steep one. Not physically, and no one really judges him for it, bar the odd jab from Itsuki or the KKK. No, it's a little more complicated than that. See, the family unit Shuffle presents is very traditional Japanese. That's not to say it's hyper-accurate to that or anything, but it certainly conforms to it. Keade cooks, cleans, prepares lunches, and does the bulk of the child minding. Meanwhile, Primula is an ideal seen, not heard kind of child, impeccably well behaved and helpful around the house. By all rights, this should put Rin in the position of the family/the household breadwinner, but due to their circumstances, it doesn't. In fact, as we'll talk about later, Rin is essentially flaunting around the place with other women, right in front of his partner and child. There's something perverse, almost sickening about it when you see it in more in episodes 18 to 20. More pressingly in 12 to 13, we see Rin finally embodying his outdated man-of-the-house role when it comes down to him to decide Primila's fate. It isn't something he's ready for, and while Keade is framed by his side through most of it, it eventually comes down to just being Rin and Rin alone to choose. The kings, fantastical magic otherworldly beings and adults defer to him. His friends plead their cases, and ultimately all responsibility falls on his shoulders alone. As mentioned, he chooses the seemingly right option, but as episode 13 progresses, with the kids attending their everyday school lives, we see the real effects that this is having on him, and on them all. In particular on Rin and Keade, though. Some of it is tropey, but I can appreciate a well-placed "I made an extra lunch by accident" sort of line. It's a tired and tested cliché, and sure to pull on the heartstrings, while also quaintly communicating that they're missing her more than they would have expected. Again, it's no plan ad, but I find it impressive just how much they managed to do in such a short time. Continuing this man-of-the-house theme, you'll also note how Rin is meant to hide his emotions. The others can cry or lament, but Rin is shown actively trying to be resolute, brave for Keade and the others' sakes. The most pain he shows is some brooding in the school park. This also ties back neatly into his altruism complex, as he does all this and takes all this responsibility without ever actually having him or anyone else utter a word to acknowledge it, or rather more importantly, no one ever asks him to do any of it. There's also another piece of great cinematography I just want to quickly mention here, as it doesn't really fit into the flow with the rest of this review. And that's when Rin learns that Primila is never coming back. There's some interesting stuff here, including some great questions of morality and more characterization for Rin, as well as the kings, with Mabo delivering his best line in the whole anime. "We did it because we knew there'd be no one to grieve her," which sums him and Jin up in one, but mostly I just want to very quickly address the framing. Rin stands face away from the camera, looking towards the king of the gods and the demons, who are basked in an almost heavenly glow by the sunset outside, eyes obscured by the light. They simply tell him that he can never see her again. So with this massive responsibility firmly placed on his shoulders, condemnation from actual God and Satan, and some serious guilt to cope with, it's then that Asuka strikes. Or not, as the case may be. Asa keeps spoiling the plot. Take another moment to talk in more detail about young Miss Shigure. As my somewhat fictitious, slightly hyperbolic title implies, to those paying attention, Asa has a habit of letting us in on the real plot of the story in small ways. A big example of this is in episode 7, where Asa gets repeatedly asked out by the soccer team captain. Very quickly, as I didn't discuss this in the fairy tale section, I've always liked how the captain is actually just a nice guy. It's necessary for the story, but also adds credence to its messages. And in many other harem rom-coms, it would have probably ended in some sort of fist fight or tennis match between the protagonist and the captain, which the protagonist would lose, only to cause the heroine to swoon out of appreciation for the effort, or some such drivel. Anyhow, getting back on topic, as the captain seems to be a genuinely nice guy, the question soon becomes, why not? It's addressed from Kariha, the ooh-la-la girl, for those who need a quick refresher, to Asa, and the answer is actually pretty important. She doesn't like or love him. It's that simple. And that's not to say she hates him or finds him unattractive. She just plainly isn't interested in him in that kind of way. And it's in this that we see something else. Reen. With the series closed, the choice of potential partners for Reen has been narrowed down to approximately Nerine, Sia, and Asa, with Primila and Keade still learning quite what that sort of romantic love is. So why pick Asa? Well, aside from their brilliant on-screen chemistry, it's simply because she's the one he likes. Now, well, we'll come back to this in due course. Asa lends another helping hand to the plot in episode 13. After witnessing a depressed Reen, Asa, who's been fairly superfluous to the story despite having some secret familial connections and similarities to it, takes her into a park bench for a chat. We see through the show that some people, including Miss Mao the teacher, in episode 11, rely on Asa's level-headedness and common sense for advice, despite her young age. In Rin's case, this is especially apt, as she is both the childhood friend and the senpai character in his life. It's also just nice to see her comfort and listen to her friend's woes in his time of need. It isn't dramatic or shot in some dazzling way. Instead, it's an almost mundane setting. It makes it feel all the more realistic. After a short conversation, we get another of my favourite moments in the show. Asa doesn't slap Rin. The whole way through the scene you expect it. A generic slap before Rin comes to his senses and goes crusading off to rescue Primula. But that moment never comes. Instead, Asa just talks to Rin, because really that's all he needs. Not to be judged or lambasted, but to be reassured that he has the right to make a decision that he believes is right. Not what everyone else thinks is right. And it gets better as Asa accompanies him home and even helps him with convincing the other girls. It's really great and helps to further foreshadow their romantic relationship and solidify their union as best friends. With a push from Nerine, he breaks down and proclaims those who are of the upper echelons of elitism, and a welcome return of the more traditional anime OP songs like Misara. The soundscape and the OG high school cast, all grown up. Everyone say, "Oh, now." He takes her in, cares for her, helps her realise that. In Rin's own words to Isuki. Welcome back. This is episode 3 of our long-form shuffle retrospective review. You can click the iCard for the playlist with all the parts, or go down below to read the entire review via Mel's blog tab. Last time we spoke on episode 12, 13, plus Asa and her role in the early stages in the plot. Now then, to episode 15, what was regained. For now we're going to forgo discussing episode 14 for a minute, as with its advent we mostly have all the pieces we need to talk about Narine's character as a whole, so let's put that aside for a moment. Episode 15 of Shuffle is in an interesting position, as by standard narrative conventions it is the climax of the story. Logic follows that everything afterwards should be falling action, but as anyone who's watched the show knows, this is far from the case. The plot loosely revolves around the gang of Rin, Sia, Nerine and Keade, and in a sense Lycoris, Narine's dead clone sister twin, going to rescue Primila from the demon world. I say rescue, but really it's more like a hospital visit that turns into a retrieval. The actual plot is fairly simple all in all. Primila's condition suddenly worsens and threatens a repeat of the first experiment's catastrophic meltdown. Meanwhile, Rin, with assistance from Lycoris, helps Primila feel loved, and in doing so, saves her, and everyone else present. From Primila's perspective, we see a cross between her introspective consciousness and flashbacks, along with some interesting sunflower field imagery. Breaking all this down opens us up to some dense symbolism, as I'm a rank amateur in terms of cinematography. There are also definitely better suited people to analyse these scenes. Nonetheless, I can't find anyone else doing so I shall do my utmost to fill in this role. At the very first scene of the episode, it's a short clip of a dragon-like creature swooping across the screen before a cut to some forest and our gang of heroes. The scene is by no means superb, but still impressive to look at, and works on a few levels. For one, it's an example of the show's many shuffle points. Based on its own namesake, the show frequently changes the tone or direction via an aesthetic, often short-lived, art style change. This is definitely one of those, and overall the moment works on 3 distinct levels. Firstly, for the casual audience, it communicates that we've left the realm of Earth. It's an obvious assumption, but also a well-made one. Had we just cut to the gang walking through the forest, you could conceivably mistake it for somewhere like the Amazon. Instead, the dragon clues in anyone who may have missed the previous episode or who is simply not paying enough attention that this isn't Kansas anymore. Secondly, it works as some small world building. Aside from flashbacks and cutaways, we spend very little time in the demon world other than in this specific episode, so using the opportunity to show us a completely detached location that helps flesh out this world is a nice touch, and I always appreciate the extra effort put into small details like this. Finally, however, is the aforementioned shuffle point. By showing this as our first scene of the episode, in an episode that specifically decides not to include the usual opening title song, the tone is immediately set that this episode is going to be a departure. Prominently gone is the somber tone of the previous 3 episodes, replaced with one of a quest, an adventure, in an unknown land. Note how the dragon and surrounding area come across as hostile secondary, but primarily as awe-inspiring, a massive world which shows might be content to explore in great detail. With this, we're prepared for a fight, and a triumph, because episode 15 is a reward for Rin. He criticises himself in monologues, becomes depressed, and then took responsibility for the actions he's taken. With help from Asa, as represented brilliantly by the double entendre red ribbon she gifts to Nerine, he's learned from his mistake, made a decision based on what he believes is best for Primila, and done his best to take Narine's feelings into consideration as well. It's also another example of Shuffle harnessing its animation medium. To capture a 5-second shot like this in live action would be incredibly expensive, from the vivid colours of the set pieces palette, including the blue sky and bright canyon, to creating a dragon that isn't just a CGI monstrosity. Replicating the tone this achieves in live action would be no small feat. Well, of course you could communicate something similar in a book format. Words often don't have such an ability to rapidly bombard the audience with such intriguing, rapid-fire imagery. It should suffice to say that I appreciate these opening moments a lot. Moving on, there's plenty to talk about. From the kings who break convention and simply let our heroes pass, to morally bankrupt scientists and a surprisingly epic or grandiose battle-style scene, the finale toning on Primila's involvement throughout. As I said at the top, she displays an internal struggle throughout the whole arc, as portrayed by the White Void, which was once her room, and barren, rainy fields, alongside sunflower-filled meadows. Some great imagery, and to talk proper about it, let's first address Shuffle's motif and use of colour. Colour motif. It should be obvious to the most casual of casual viewers that Shuffle indulges in the usual anime candy-coloured hair scheming, and while it's in no way unique, I think how Shuffle uses it in its character designs and storytelling is pretty interesting. First off, there's the hair colours. It's worth noting that they nicely match the characters who wear them. Keade, the most human, is ginger. It's very bright, but that's kind of standard in anime. See Lieutenant Matilda for an early example from the 70s, 80s. Rin has brown hair and a dark green hue to his colour palette. Meanwhile, Asa initially seems flamboyant, but by the end of the series, her hair colour makes sense. Then we have Sia's crimson and Narine's magenta, representative of their otherworldly nature, the fact that they aren't human and certainly don't act like it. This actually extends to the side characters in a fun way too. Itsuki is a human, and his hair shows this in its standard chestnut brown coloration, also matching his uniform design too, which is a nice detail. Mayumi is a half-demon, and her design gives that off. She's short with discoloured eyes and a darker hair tone, almost imp-like features translated into a cute girl design. Finally, there's Kareha, ooh la la, an actual god. She's got long blonde hair tied in petite ribbons, a pale skin and a tall build, almost fairy or angel-like. She might even be described as elf, further aided by her frequent comical glowing in the more light-hearted scenes. Aside from these nice considerations in character design, the colour motif goes further, invading the OP, the title logo, and the story. For example, almost every third line of my notes seems to mention some use of lighting to represent the character's feelings or emotional state, and this goes doubly if not triply for Primila. Due to her reserved nature, even near the end of the show, the bulk of her emotional communication is simply done with lighting changes, often reflected off her deadpan expression. But in the Awakening arc, we see it used further. Unlike his usually conventional, Primila's internal world is far from black. Instead, it's a pitch white room with the white and absence of colour, representing her loneliness and isolation. Primila herself is even lit a little bit brighter in most of these scenes to further increase her appearance's closeness to the colour white. After all, Primila's design in terms of colour is grey, a shadow of colour, but with 2 red ribbons tied into ponytails, indicative of the brief moments of love she's felt throughout her life. The white in her room, or cell even, is drowning. There's no real borders, no way in or out, just the endless sea of nothing until Lycoris appear. appears. With Narine's signature magenta hair colour, her very presence alone illuminates the room and brings life to Primila's brief existence. We see this more throughout, but hopefully this short segment has helped to communicate the importance of the show's use of colour, within and outside its character designs. Talk about Lycoris. Something interesting that I only realised in this specific rewatch of Shuffle is how I've never actually questioned the legitimacy of Primila's relationship to Lycoris, or that of any of the characters for that matter. I'm a bit of a stickler for this thing if you've read my other stuff. It wasn't until over halfway through its third series that I bought into the relationship of Stephen Moffat's Sherlock Holmes and Watson, and by then that was far too little too late. Shuffle is a masterful way of characterising its cast in small but meaningful ways. Take Itsuki, Mayumi, Rin and Keade. We're told they've all attended school together for some time, but the show isn't content with just that, instead displaying it in small ways, how well they each know each other. For example, in Omelette of Happiness, the four discuss each other's cooking with mixed levels of contempt based on clear, unseen prior experiences, or how Asa's physicality is in the form of an energetic wake-up slaps towards Rin, which helps to communicate their childhood friend closeness, or just the entirety of the character building in episode 11. Why all this matters is to help make the world feel more alive and feel more lived in, while also making our primary cast feel more realistic, and we see this again with Lycoris. Long before her brief on-screen stint, we see that Nerine and Primila have something of an uneasy relationship. Nerine refers to Primila as Rimu, but often in a hesitant manner. Meanwhile, Primila never replies in kind, and often ignores her completely. The audience should be compelled to wonder about this, seeing as one would initially think that there's some form of estranged sisters, Shin's bastard child maybe. However, with hindsight we come to understand that to Primila, Nerine really is little more than a stranger, and for Nerine, all her familiarity comes from the fact that she inherited Lycoris' feelings and memories of Primila, among other choice memories including her vocal cords. This all matters because when Primila is finally confronted with Lycoris inside the dreamscape, for both her and the audience there is a sense of familiarity, as though we already know Lycoris, and that's because the show has been doing subtle groundwork since the beginning. It should also be noted that while Lycoris and Nerine literally have identical clone cells, they are not the same person, with Lycoris being far more of a big sister character, a lot more outgoing and helpful. She's similar to Asa in that sense, which might be another reason for why the writer decided to have her exit stage left for the final part of this arc, though those parallels are by no means missed. Primila calls out to Lycoris as her sister. It's 15 episodes of build-up that pull on the heartstrings and are a full payoff for a relationship we only get to see glimpses of. Returning to the sunflower scene, we see Lycoris walk off into the sunflowers, away from Primila, into an eternal summer, paradise, heaven, or even maturity. Whatever way you want to put it, leaving Primila behind. It's a place Primila can't follow her to, and it plays magnificently into a theme of neglect. Rin turns her away, and in a sense so does Lycoris. It's not to say that she does so deliberately, but by giving her life to Nerine, she in turn leaves Primila alone forever. Except Primila did try to follow her, by pursuing her, seeking out the boy Lycoris talks so fondly of, only for him to eventually betray her wishes as well. Of course, that means it's only appropriate that in the end it's neither Lycoris, Nerine or Rin who individually save Primila, but a combination of all three. Rin accepting his feelings and casting aside his illusions of what's right and wrong for a man. Nerine realising her wish to avoid loss was simply a cause of another form of losing, and Lycoris making good on her promise to be there for Primila. In just one episode, the show manages to completely and satisfactorily wrap up 4 character arcs in one go. This isn't to say they're done growing as people. It will be some time before Nerine and Primila truly show the signs of this growth, but to me that's how natural character development should be. In the meantime, Rin has a long ways to go. While he definitely develops in a piece of brilliant character writing, all he's really done is swap out his decision to follow the order of society and replaced it by simply following what Asa told him to do. And the show is oh so aware of this. His arc does end here, and it's a fateful send-off. I've always loved how, without overshadowing the others' efforts, Lycoris is still the main player in this situation, helping Primila from both the outside and inside. To set the scene, despite our hero's best efforts, words simply aren't getting through to Primila, and her magic is going critical. The demise of our hero seems imminent and inevitable, until Lycoris, using the last of her consciousness, cancels out Primila's power, just long enough for Rin to reach her and snap her out of it. In this moment, Lycoris proves herself as the true older sister and guardian of the group. An internal adult version of her gets to say one true final goodbye to Primila before walking into the sunflowers one last time. To me, it's nice how this defies conventions. It isn't just the protagonist she's known for a few months calls to her, or that a memory of a lost one comes to her, but a combination of both, combined with the fantastical manifestation of Lycoris' will. It makes for a great set piece and a fitting finale, one that would set Shuffle far above most of its contemporaries in character writing and execution alone, but the show's got a lot more up its sleeve to come. For now, we'll leave episode 15 behind us, though you can be sure we'll soon revisit it when addressing episode 14 and Narine's character, as well as when we come back to revisit Primila's character study later on. As a final note, there's a nice prologue scene post the whole confrontation, whereby Rin gets to give Primila his jacket, allowing him to walk around in a tank top, accentuating his own figure, and acting as a nice visual metaphor for how his accepting his emotions was far more manly than his stoic actions in episode 12, now rewarded by him talking down to the gods while looking like some sort of Chad bodybuilder. It's some pretty great stuff, but for now let's take a step back. Episode 14, and Character Study, Nerine. Despite Primila's low number of lines, Nerine is no doubt the story's most understated character. In fact, her role in the series' second half is more akin to that of a secondary supporting role than as a love interest, and that's with some good reason. First off, let's note how Shuffle likes to weave his storytelling into its character's personality. Well, some of this could be called coincidence. If it is, then it's the happy sort for sure. For example, Keade, the girl who's happy as long as Rin is happy, waits for her turn in the spotlight the longest. Meanwhile, Primila, the least developed person, has the least romantic of the storylines. It's a nice touch, and you can even see it going one step further in the very layout of the show. Our first two arcs are based solely in fantasy, and are the ones most conveyed through metaphors. Sia's arc appropriately straddles the line between real-life schizophrenia or bipolar disorder and more fantasy jargon. And finally we have Keade and Asa, far more grounded in reality at the end of the story. It's no surprise that Narine's reserved nature lends her story to be overshadowed by that of those around her, but it's no less well written for it. Well, I could definitely see someone being disappointed in Narine's reduced role post episode 15. I personally find it wonderful how she gets the chance to develop and live her life for herself, rather than simply following blindly after Rin's daily shenanigans. The small snippets we see of her joining a club, continuing in her pursuits of the ultimate omelette, and having friends outside the main group are to me a multitude more rewarding than a gaggle of other harem anime that have the main guy and girl hook up, only to then have all the girls act as though this never happened. I'm staring at you, High School DxD, Infinite Stratus, Sword Art Online, etc. That's not to say she doesn't still pursue Rin, but she comes to do it as a secondary part of her life, more like a hobby, not as her whole focus for living. I have in my notes, you can pinpoint the exact moment that her heart breaks, in relation to the scene following Primila's rescue, wherein Rin and Narine return Asa's ribbon, and I stand by that. In this moment, Narine once and for all stops living for Lycoris, and instead starts living for herself, just like her sister would have wanted. This conclusion links most importantly to the main themes explored through her and Sia's parallel characters, survivor's guilt and a lack of self-worth. Both Sia and Narine share these two hang-ups, but to different extents. Sia clearly has a bigger issue with her own self-worth, while Narine feels immense guilt in surviving in place of her sister. The two ideas are similar, but not quite the same story, one of the show's main through lines. Survivor's guilt. Narine's survivor's guilt is the crux of her story. Her purpose for coming to the real world and chasing Rin is purely out of perceived duty to fulfill Lycoris' wish. In a sense, she's got something of an imposter syndrome complex, going as far as to claim her ability to sing is stolen. As we've already discussed, while a young girl, Narine's power led her to be extremely ill. Lycoris, whose lifespan was limited to begin with, sacrifices herself to save Narine, but unbeknownst to everyone else, Narine acquires more than just a restored constitution. We can also infer that this guilt hangs over Narine for some time, till she finally decides the best course of action is to simply live life for Lycoris. Also infer that this guilt hangs over Nerine for some time, till she finally decides the best course of action is to simply live the life Lycoris always wanted. And in a heartbreaking fashion, Nerine actually gives this away a couple of times if one pays attention, but most particularly is when she asks Rin if she can start loving him even more. It initially comes off as an inconsequential confession. That is, until with hindsight, we understand that what she really means is that she's admitted both to Rin, us, and in no small way to herself, that she might love Rin personally, and not just because of the memories she inherited. It's an interesting principle and clues us in that during the whole first arc, really up till the close of episode 15, Nerine is acting on behalf of an agenda and not because of her own feelings. This all comes to a head in episode 14, and in an interesting one, as it takes the momentum of episode 13, seemed to have ended on, and converts that energy into a long, heavy dialogue session. The whole thing, for the most part, is just a conversation between Rin and Nerine, set in the playground where Rin first met Lycoris, and most recently in episode 1, Nerine. It's a little exposition heavy, but with cutaways to break up the visuals and Narine's emotional explanation, it works really well. The discussion comes off as necessary and mature, rather than just for the purpose of giving the audience new facts to mull over. We come to understand the lengths to which Nerine has gone to live up to the life she gained, now seeing why she's so formal and princess-like, aside from her actual position. To a casual viewer, till this moment it might have seemed Narine's infatuation with Rin was built on some rather shaky ground, of one encounter as a kid, but to Nerine, he's the boy who made Lycoris' life a little bit brighter. She in a sense is living one of her sister's regrets out to on her side. I love how this episode manages to deal with multiple deep-seated issues at once. For example, if you wanted to, you can interpret Lycoris' sacrifice as something more akin to an organ transplant, once again showing how the fantasy elements are really only there as some quality set dressing. Moreover, I've always loved the discussion on why the Demon Society uses clones and artificial people. It wasn't some cliché about them not being real people, or even an understandable but immoral stance like the ends justify the means. No, instead, they didn't not do it out of malice, but because no one would mourn the clones when they die. It's a fascinating idea, and it's made clear that Shin would rather not put anyone's life in danger. The morality is grey as heck, and I find that intriguing coming from the king of the demons and the king of the gods. Nerine is the simplest of the characters we'll be examining, but I believe her theme of guilt, which links wonderfully with other characters like Asa and Rin, works brilliantly, and gives us a well-fleshed out character despite her minimal on-screen presence. She puts it best herself. That's why I've decided to live as Lycoris. Let that part of her take over. To me, there's no better way her story could have ended. As already mentioned, for her to move on with her own life, to make new friends, have and lead new experiences, and grow to pursue love for her own causes. Narine's character is all about coming to accept and love her yourself. Her arc ends with that line that in a sense started her story back when she first uttered something similar to it, but now it represents progress, not stagnation. So now I believe the feelings I have are my own. The Lycoris part of me has vanished, but my love remains. These feelings are mine and mine alone. From this point forward, my love is for you and not for someone else. So I might fall more in love with you. That is, of course, only if you'll let me. End of episode 3. I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to leave a like or press the subscribe button or a comment. And till the next one, thanks for watching. Intermission. So, 12,500 odd words in, and we've covered the first 15 episodes in varying degrees of detail. Shorter than I'd imagined, which gives me some vague degree of hope I've managed to reduce the amount of flannel my writing style is prone to, and leave out too much of the larger technical sections that I'm not well enough versed in to properly discuss. Now seems like a good time to take a moment to look at some outlying things. I personally always leave a short break between episodes 15 and 16 when watching the show, which we'll address more shortly. So let's follow suit of that and address the dub as well as the intro and outro songs, or the whole OST and soundscape in general. The dub. For me, the dub of Shuffle is a must-watch, so much so that I've never been able to get through the sub as the voices are just so familiar to me in English, which is strange because I'm usually pretty good at swapping between the two mediums, a la Zero no Tsukaima. It's an early Funimation dub from before they bought out most of the competition and still had to actively make an effort. As such, there's some really great vocal performances here, and I don't think anyone lets down the team. Is it perfect? Probably not, but it's my belief that there's no such thing as a perfect dub or sub. We only think all subs are sacred because we don't speak Japanese. I refrain from a full discussion on my stance here, but generally, if it's from the 2000s or most of the 90s, then go with the dub. It won't change much, if anything, except for the end of Ava dub that can burn in hell. And in reality, the experience will be closer to what you'd have gotten if you were a native Japanese speaker. That's not to say all dubs are good, far from it. And with dubs from the last decade, from the newer Funimation studio style, it can be a case-by-case basis kind of game. With that needlessly said, the shuffle dub really is terrific. It's one of my personal favourite performances from Monica Rial, but while she really is brilliant throughout, I wouldn't say she's the star by any measure. Rin, Jerry Jewell, and Primila, Shireen Lee, and really all the cast do a great job, but two performances stand out in particular. Sia's voice actress, Brittany Kabrushki, during her arc has the task of voicing two similar but fundamentally different personalities, and she does it wonderfully. At one point during a confrontation between Sia and Kikyou, the alter ego, the harsher voice tone she uses for Kikyou softens until you realise they've stopped sounding different but are rather more speaking in sync. It's really impressive, and I don't think it hits quite as hard in the Japanese, though that may be a biased opinion. But overall, Keade's voice actress, Carrie Savage, takes the cake far and away. At the start of the show, her voice may come off as somewhat shrill, the classic trope of an adult playing a supposedly kawaii anime girl. However, you soon grow to appreciate the nuance of her performance, and when it comes time for Keade's arc, she shows an amazing range. Her screams of anger and frustration, the "get out of my house" line that has shivers down your spine, only to be matched by the heart-wrenching, almost ugly cries of sadness she gives later on in the same story arc. To wrap it up, after the arc's resolution, her more sombre, less angst-filled sobs and her attempts to hold a conversation without breaking into tears are really fantastic. It's one of my all-time favourite dub performances, and I'd love to hear this voice actress more often. Just brilliant. Opening song and dance. For me, there are anime songs I like but skip on a binge watch. Songs I'll almost never skip, like the first intro of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood by You, which I'll watch, say, 80+% of the time. And then there's the 90% plus grouping. Songs and intros I pretty much never skip. Neon Genesis Eva is of course one. And more recently, Revolutionary Girl Utena has joined this group. And for me, Shuffle is the other one that springs to mind immediately. It's packed full of purpose, and the song has a soft spot in my heart. There's an old Kristen V English cover of it that I also love. The intro is full to the brim with colour coding and parallel imagery, in order to implant ideas into the viewer from the get-go of every episode. Let's break down a few. There's the obvious fact that the title letters are rainbow coloured, and of course a section where we see various characters by their colour on a white background, similar in style to the introspective place Primila's mind retreated to. Then there's the expressive use of different nature elements to show a representation of each girl, except for, in the case of Primila, who is framed behind concrete, a man-made substance. A metaphor for Primula goes even further. We have a few brief shots of Nerine and Sia in regal clothes plus settings, representing the fantasy elements they bring to the table, followed by Keade and Asa living their ordinary lives, indicative of their more realistic nature, then followed by Primula, alone holding the stuffed animal doll on a backdrop of turbines. Now, aside from giving those who've played If My Heart Had Wings terrible flashbacks, this should act as a representation of what Primula is. Not only is she framed separate and alone, which sharply contrasts the others, but also the wind turbine is a man-made object that harnesses nature to produce energy. Primula is a man-made person who harnesses natural magic to attempt to create infinite life. It's a neat parallel. Another element of the intro that I really like is how the music syncs to the visuals in an unusual way. The song starts with barely any instruments and just vocals, as we get shots of the 5 girls, each with a close-up. However, as the vocal track cuts out, we get a synth mixed with electric guitar segment as images of the town our heroes inhabit flash by. However, with the lyrics gone, so too are the people, as the town lies empty, this communicating to us that the setting plays second fiddle to the people, who without there is no colour, something of a prevalent message within the show. As the vocals cut back in, we get to be reacquainted to the characters as they greet one another. It's an interesting technique to have the music and visuals linked like this, and not something I've seen often elsewhere. There's also plenty of shots of the gang simply living their ordinary lives, going to school, eating, etc., to help convey a sense of familiarity between the show and the audience. Though this is far more conventional than my previous point, all in all the intro has a sense of energy and pace to match its bop of a track, and it's a pleasure to look for all the little hintful bits of foreshadowing and references to the events of the show. I'd love to go more in depth, however, if I'm out of my element with the narrative and visual components, then I sure as heck aren't qualified to talk about opening songs, so I'll leave it here for now. The outro is a bit more interpretive. Some points of note in it are the directions each girl look in, which match the arrows at the start of the more light-hearted episodes in the title cards, though this may be a loose connection. More abundant is the backdrop behind each girl, which portrays their associated seasons. i.e. Sia is standing in the rainy season, as heavily referenced in episode 2, and Primila is behind a winter landscape, which we as the audience associate with her ice magic, as well as her themes of being unnatural and infertile. Party to this is how the outro loops. The spark that blooms into a flower is the same tear that falls at the end. This gives the impression of a never-ending cycle, which is quite apt considering that each girl, Nerine, has to first have their fairy tale broken, fall to a low point, and then rise up above it. Overall, the outro is definitely more interpretable than I've gone into here, and I'd love to hear the opinions of anyone else and your take on it. One thing I've always thought would benefit both the intro and outro is if the animations changed ever so slightly as the series progressed. Nothing major. Maybe Primula have a costume change to represent her new maturity after episode 15, or Kikyou's more happy face could reflect or something post episode 17. Something to that effect anyway. As well as that, I'd say similar could be done with the outro by changing its order so that the girl whose arc is in the focus always comes last, as Primula always being the one crying makes little sense during Sia or Asa's arcs. However, I can see how moving the winter aesthetic to the earlier in the song would or might change the thematic effect of it all, just as a thought that strikes me from time to time when rewatching the show. To finish out, we have the rest of the OST. It's fairly normal visual novel lineup. I personally really enjoy it, though I could see why it might not blow you away. A favourite track for me is when Keade loses control, lashing out at Asa, and the score plays a distorted version of the more playful, everyday track that we're used to. It's a classic horror movie trick, and it's much appreciated. As I say, my music knowledge is rather lacking, so I shan't use any more of your time addressing the topic, but to suffice to say, the score serves its purpose expertly and is a welcome member of the visual novel musical canon. While it may not always match up to Canon, Planad, School Days or Grizia, or the aforementioned If My Heart Had Wings, I believe it still embodies the same spirit of those scores, though is arguably the weakest element of the show. Mind you, not by much. Now, back to our main feature. Episode 16, Kikyou and Character, Sia. The show's use of parallel teaming, let's now take a closer look at and cover Sia and Kikyou's characters on the far side of our brief intermission. It should be briefly clarified that from here on out we will be mentioning topics such as bipolarism, codependency syndrome, depression, more terminal illnesses, and child neglect. And while I'm better read on some of these than others, I'm no expert on any of them, so please take everything I say with a grain of salt, and if you're affected by any of the issues, please seek out the appropriate help. I sincerely wish you all the best in whatever your endeavour may be. Listed episode 16 as part of the Awakening arc, while listing episode 17 as part of the True Feelings arc. This is because 16 works in the same format as episodes 12 to 15, with Sia being snatched out of her fragile mentality, while 17 is far more like episodes 21, in that while Reen and the respective other are able to come to a peaceful conclusion, neither triumphs in the way, say, we did in episode 15. You could of course divide Shuffle in multiple different ways, one simply being to mark episodes 1 to 15 as Arc 1 and 16 to 24 as Arc 2, but there's one more nice nod to my system, and that's the fact that once again it matches a character's personality by having Sia's arc be spread over two different storytelling archetypes. With that framing device out of the way, let's get to looking at the scenes, and at Sia as a character. There's a lot that goes on in these last 9 episodes, and far less that we can skim over as we did with Arc 1. Episode 16 deals with Sia's downward spiral into a depressive, self-loathing state that had been hinted to since the beginning, leading to her being confronted by her sister, which I believe can be taken as a thinly veiled metaphor for bipolar disorder. The episode has some great minor things of note at its onset. First, there's a rooftop lunch where the characters talk about how great it is that everything is back to normal. Part of what I like about this scene is how untrue it is, simply by the merit of Asa and Kariha being there. It's nothing major, but the use of the top-down wide shots helps to point out how things are clearly different to how they were once before, especially in the closeness of Reen and Asa. There's Reen's treatment of the girls. Clever camera work makes it so that during her one scene in the episode, Reen doesn't turn his back on Primula. Meanwhile, Nerine leaves school before him, meaning that he never walks away from the two who are now moving forward with their lives. Further, accentuated by Primula's new, more mature outfit and a lack of the toy cat plushie. Well, in the meanwhile, Reen walks away and borderline ignores both Sia and Keade, but instead is walking directly towards and actively seeking out Asa, more than twice in the episode. This culminates in Sia seeing Reen and Asa shopping. After witnessing how happy they are, the camera turns back to reveal her absence, and in doing so, the last piece is in place for Sia's arc. Sia as a character, as already mentioned, is similar to Nerine in that she has a degree of survivor's guilt, but more than that, a complete lack of self-worth, believing she has no real value and that compared to the others, including Kikyou, she doesn't really deserve Reed. In just 10 minutes of screen time, in a completely natural way, Sia's personal resolve buckles, and she's finally forced to face to face herself, and to more importantly, face Kikyou. This next scene is the first of Sia's two confrontations between herself and her sister, and there are some of my favourites packed full of more simplistic but highly effective storytelling. First we see Sia walking home after seeing Rin and Asa at the shops. She's placed along the line of the centre right of the 9 quadrant, which immediately helps her to look small. This is then added to by the sunset, which bathes the whole area in a warm red, making Sia's seemingly vibrant hair blend into its surroundings. The whole shot is great and confides in us what she's feeling right now, small, lonely, and beaten. It's followed by more use of lighting, and to great effect, as we watch Sia walk straight past her father, who still expects her to make dinner, despite the late hour, and into the darkness. Now we know that she's essentially not even seen him due to being lost and taught, and is heading straight to her room. But visually, we watch her step past her father, a god basked in the light of his traditionalist Japanese home, and straight into a bleak darkness. It's brilliant, but all these nice examples of lighting to communicate her mental state are soon overshadowed by what occurs next. Sia enters her room to hear a voice not quite her own. There's so many great shots here, starting with a top-down look at her face, his reaction to the voice. It's downright terrified, and the angle seems to almost shrink all her features. The body she flaunts so openly in fan service now seems small and unassuming. Such angle of Sia standing in the doorway soon arrives, and with it we see her literal shadow now looms large behind her. The conversations between Sia and Kikyou are great. While they may not be wholly accurate to schizophrenia or bipolar syndrome, they never actually claim to be, while still being some of the most easy to understand representations of mental illness in all of anime. Initially comes across as an antagonist, which is a nice touch. As well, I'm glad she's eventually revealed to be well-meaning. Her initial hostility adds a layer of tension and risk to the otherwise passive character motive-driven storyline. The mirror, which has loomed over Sia all series long, refer back to the bedrooms, and has frequently reflected a different expression to the one Sia is wearing, is now paid off as the confrontation goes on between the two. That is till you realise Sia and the camera aren't actually looking at the mirror. In fact, it's blank. Kikyou is instead standing, legs surrounded in a haze behind the mirror. If a mirror is the gateway to the soul, then she is literally said soul hiding behind the eyes, or visually behind the blank mirror. It's a nice touch, and it can take a couple of seconds before you even realise the discrepancy, adding on an almost spooky element to the scene. Alternatively, the camera keeps returning to Sia, but from a far-off view, making her look even more afraid and frail. Even her stance backs up, her hands prostrated as though to pray, and her face partially turned away. The two argue with Sia finally admitting that she doesn't feel worthy to pursue Rin any longer, and admitting a degree of guilt at the fact that Kikyou can never find love for herself. In an instant, Sia's expression changes, revealing that Kikyou has taken control of the body. The foreshadowing for this up along in Sia's reflections, as well as when she briefly took control, snapped some sense into Nerine in episode 14, come to full fruition here as Kikyou assumes command. I'm really sorry for saying that name different each time. I think there's actually something pretty unsettling about this whole thing. The idea that your body could suddenly be grasped from you and your consciousness unwillingly locked away. We also get another great example of Shuffle's abusing of its animation medium by using slightly harder drawn expressions with narrow eyes to clue in the audience of the change in persona. So then, how did we get here, one might wonder? Kikyou seems to be antithetical to Sia. She's overly aggressive, sexually charged, and seemingly highly selfish. However, examining her and Sia more closely reveals far more similarities than not. For one, while she isn't as aggressive as Kikyou, Sia is arguably the most forward of the harem group, a fact that comes to a head in episode 10 when she or her father accidentally spread a rumour that she's to be wed to Reine. We've seen her used as a primary fan service character, and aside from Asa later on, and what was more of a meeting with Nerine, Sia is the only other girl to actually go on a date with Reine. Same thing with the sexuality. Sia is highly physical, often making use of her assets to escort Rin, with only Asa coming close to matching her number of fan service scenes in the first arc. Then there's the selfishness. While Kikyou seems selfish, Sia seems more naive, not at first realizing the effect her actions might have on the other girls, as shown by the daydream, where she envisions her, Nerine, and Keade at their joint wedding to Nerine. Asa is excluded due to her lack of publicness in her feelings early on, and Sia does question if Primila would want to be there, but she isn't considered a true member of the harem till 22, and therefore not included in the daydream. A closer look reveals something interesting about both Sia and Kikyou as characters. What we perceive initially as selfish or naive acts are in truth acts of harmful altruism. It's maybe the biggest theme of the whole show, but Sia is in fact being selfish in her naively aggressive style towards Rin, because she wants to make Kikyou happy. Conversely, Kikyou only takes control of Sia's body to try and improve Sia's failing life and mental state. Both are acting out of care for one another, but going about it in equally wrong ways, just like what we saw when Nerine sent Primula away, and in Narine's loss aversion techniques. So in reality, the two aren't so far removed, something that will get revealed more in episode 17 than 16, which before we move on to, let's address episode 16's biggest twist yet. Yeah, its biggest twist yet. Its use of fan service as a plot device. Oh really, it does. At the start of the episode, the gang, mainly Itsuki, discuss how red lingerie is representative of a more confident woman, or words roughly to that effect. Sia takes some interest in this, while Mayumi and the rest of the grouping dismiss Itsuki out of hand in the usual manner. However, astute viewers will notice how normally Sia's panty shots are sorry. However, astute viewers will notice how the normal Sia panty shots are from hair used to aid in the representation of her mental state. This ends during her discourse with Kikyou, when we see that they are plain as possible, expressing her newfound lack of confidence and defeated, detrimental mindset. However, when Kikyou takes over and appears in front of Rin at the very end of the episode, the underwear is now a dark purple shade of crimson. She's gone straight past confidence to a colour more confident than red, and in doing so we witness the use of fan service to further tell the story. Before we move properly into episode 17 and the third arc of the show, the honest feelings arc for our purposes, let's finish our analysis of Sia. While at first sight she appears to be an airheaded fan service vehicle, underneath we find a surprisingly introspective young lady with some serious mental hang-ups. Her attraction to the rain in episode 2 immediately clues us in, as we'd expect her to be the Genki type and associate more heavily with the sunshine, yet we catch her in contemplation over the rain. Something else of note is how, aside from Rin, our protagonist, remember, only Sia has moments of internal monologue. Primula has the dream sequences, but that's more like a coma. This should tell us a lot about her as a person. She's self-conscious. She has to be if she's the only other character allowed a monologue. This lack of self-worth becomes more apparent on subsequent rewatches, as her earlier episode sessions, trying to decide what to wear down to the undergarment level, and her obscene over-planning of her date with Rin, clue us in that Sia actually does a lot more thinking than one might first think. We'd see a similar character arc to this in Taradara's own Genki girl turned reliable best friend Minori a few years later. Sia's story arc and theme are that of self-acceptance, coming to terms with the fact that she does have self-worth, and that she does deserve to find happiness, even if Kikyou can never truly in the same way, which of course we see in action in episode 17, Honest Feelings. So picks up where 16 left off, with Kikyou taking Rin on a date. Straight off the bat we have a hesitant Rin, though importantly he still goes along with it. We witness the date almost from afar, with particular shots taken from the park, which we visited before, namely with Asa in episode 13. The distance of the shots and the slightly skewed fashion in which Rin and Kikyou are drawn running and holding hands makes for a great way to visually show how unnatural their date is, as though even their body language is standing in opposition, a tricky thing to convey through TV animation. The date goes on with Kikyou eventually flashing Rin in the changing room. This is where the tone really shifts from an awkward fan-servicey date to something more toxic. Rather than being played for laughs, the flash causes Rin to become stern and disapproving, while from Sia's internal perspective, Kikyou is essentially abusing her body. This all links back to a theme which we'll return to, of the idea that there is maturity in nudity, even when addressing our most fan-servicey character. On a smaller note, there is also a large quantity of mirrors and reflections of the like that inspire those objects. present in these quick cuts and scenes, which is a nice touch. It ends in, yes, yet another, of my favourite scenes. Thankfully, this one is shorter to talk about. We find the duo on the bank of a river, in pretty much the same position as Rin and Asa in episode 12. They're basked again in that same sunlight as the episode prior, which is a nice touch. However, while Kikyou speaks as though they're a long-term couple, Rin is clearly uncomfortable with the direction the day has gone in. Kikyou directly references the beach episode with the line, "Isn't it great? It's like we're the only two in the world." But not only is this a nod to that, it also mirrors Narine's actions in episode 15, with the difference being that Nerine had accepted herself, where Sia and Kikyou have not. If this was pre-episode 15 Rin, I have little doubt he may well have played along with Kikyou's game, seen the reference to the beach as romantic, and gone in for a long overdue kiss. But this is a Rin who, though not done learning yet, has made some strides forward, and as such does not play along, instead rejecting Kikyou. But let's not be too hasty. This is not absolution for Rin, just yet. For we're still definitely seeing him in the process of growing up. After all, while Rin does reject her, the right thing to do, all things considered, he arguably does it because of his not-so-subconscious feelings for Asa. In a sense, a selfish move. But more damning is he leaves Kikyou go. He doesn't chase them or visit them at their home like a good friend would. He doesn't even send them a text. In conclusion, Rin grows in this arc, but he's still got a long way to prove himself solidly, as we'll soon see. As for Kikyou, it's not over yet. She returns to the bedroom and we get a second mirror confrontation scene. Right away they make the great decision to have the screen cut in half vertically, which immediately sets the scene apart from the one we'd seen so far. Kikyou expresses a sense of confusion at what happened, but starts out defiant, while meanwhile Sia is less angry and simply remorseful. The scene is directed in such a way as to make it easy for the audience to understand Sia and Kikyou's internal dilemma. As already mentioned, while it may not be wholly accurate, I love how this scene frames her mental illness as something that's okay. Allow me to elaborate. As mentioned, through this scene, Sia properly comes to terms with the reason she's lost faith in her ability to pursue Rin. It's not because she doesn't want to hurt the other girls, but because she believes to be with him would be unfair on Kikyou. Cruel to her, who can never have a real relationship. Furthermore, she also simply doesn't think she's worthy. Kikyou is the one who talks Sia out of this way of thinking. As she slowly loses her composure, she reveals that she never asked for such pity. The art here is great, with Kikyou's face doing as much work to express her feelings and sentiments as her words do. She eventually comes to the point of tears, and this is what makes the scene so great to me. In those tears, what had seemed to be an antagonistic individual, possible personal defect, becomes humanized. The show is essentially humanizing a mental illness. What better way to say that it's okay not to be okay? That it's okay to want happiness and to not want to be alone, than to have a visual representation of bipolar syndrome break into tears as her voice crumbles down to merge with Sia's once and for all, confirming that they are a part of each other. And really that's the point. You can make it even simpler than bipolar. In a way, it's a story about realizing that it's okay to want something, even if you have a mental disability. It's okay to pursue what you want, no matter who you are. As Kikyou returns Sia's body, with the words that she'll disappear for good if it means her sister can live and rest easy, much to Sia's protest, you realize that all this has happened over the span of just 2 episodes. Everything from Arc 1 was foreshadowed and good build-up was had, sure, but in reality, in just 2 episodes, Kikyou is introduced, developed, and resolved. Friggin' amazing. Follows is one of the show's most beautiful shot scenes, with a Sia who's newly realised that Kikyou is not a burden for her to carry, a cross for her to bear, but rather a beloved part of herself. With self-acceptance in mind and heart, she stands amongst the field of flowers that wonderfully contrasts the starkly bleak and rainy setting of her and Rin's first meeting in the rainy town, and finally confesses her feelings to Rin point blank, with nowhere for him to run. Rin can't answer. Well, to be fair, he does answer, just not how she might have hoped, but definitely how she expected he would. The scene is more somber to the Nerine confession, though has a similar line of questioning as to whether Rin has already set his eyes on someone else. However, his reaction is a little altered. No longer, like prior, does he defiantly say no, and so Sia blooms among the foliage in full acceptance of herself, vowing to make Rin her husband one way or another. This isn't really what I find important. As mentioned, while he does reject her advances, Rin still doesn't really solve the problem. No, instead that comes down to Kikyou and Sia crying it out between themselves. It's something I really like about Shuffle, that it isn't just a show about Rin always saving the day and the other characters making do with whatever scraps of heroism they can attain. But moreover, it works wonders thematically, as we get to see Rin slowly improve, but in a sense still fail, as well as working as a nice foil to how Lycoris played a large role in saving Primila and Nerine, both their respective sisters. In conclusion, Sia and Kikyou have the unfavourable position of being the middle story of Shuffle, acting as a bridging point between the arcs in more ways than one. Yet it pulls it off magnificently, presenting us with an emotionally charged, brilliantly acted and expertly shot short story, about 40 minutes or less total, that could easily have been the plot of a sci-fi light feature film, with the prevailing character themes being those of a lack of self-worth and a need for self-acceptance. End of part 4. I hope you've enjoyed so far, and please come back for the next part if you'd like. Feel free to leave a like or a comment, and I'd love to hear your interpretations of the ending if they differ any what to mine, as mine are fairly vague. Thank you for watching. In the next one. Welcome back. This is part 5 of the Shuffle retrospective. Feel free to check the others with the link in the icon above. Episode 18, A Welcome Break, the one Rin loves. Episode 18 comes off on the surface as a break from the more emotionally charged episodes prior, even going so far as to go back to the old title card segment and having the more light-hearted ad break slot with the 2 cat plushies. And while in truth it definitely is more light-hearted to watch, there's still a lot going on under the bonnet which prevails throughout the whole episode, culminating in a long overdue slap at its close. Episodes 18 and 22 are the most fascinating episodes for me. Not my favourites by any means, but in some ways the most important. I was surprised with both episodes just how much I felt compelled to write on them in my notes. Keeping with our arc grouping system, True Feelings arc tree for our purposes is from episodes 17 to 21. Let's examine that a little further. Episode 17 is rather obvious, as the title of that episode concurs with us, and is about Sia plus Kikyou accepting their true feelings and inner selves. Episode 19 is Keade and Asa realizing their true feelings, but not wholly admitting to them. And episode 20 sees Primila admit her feelings 5 episodes after her arc concludes, with episode 21 having Keade come to terms with what she's already realized. So how, in this glorious narrative cohesion, does episode 18 fit in? Actually staring us right in the face. It's Rin's turn. Rin fascinates me as a harem protagonist. He's kind-hearted, sure, but that's about it. He's incredibly weak-willed in some regards, aware of his situation, yet often oblivious to the effects of his actions, sometimes inadvertently selfish, and has a faulty sense of altruism. Throughout episodes 18 to 21, we'll be addressing Shuffle's family unit a lot, that of Rin, Keade and Primila, as this is where Shuffle's deconstructive nature shines brightest. Shuffle is not a deconstructive or parody anime, but in its pursuit to gently show the flaws of its own and its contemporaries' fantasy narratives, it inadvertently manages to become one of the finest breakdowns the genre has available. As mentioned, from here on out, the show really brings home its more critical nature, and in just the opening minutes of episode 18, we get to see the start of this. In a short scene, we witness Rin apologising to Asa for the events of the prior episode. It's in their usual fashion, with Asa acting a little soon. The two bounce off one another in a fairly natural way, natural for anime at least. They're not quite flirting, but there's clearly a familiarity and chemistry between them. As this goes on, and just beforehand, we can overhear some nameless students in the background. One of them is attempting to confess to an equally unnamed boy, and while Rin and Asa banter in the foreground of the scene, we see the rigid confession scene in the background. It's a standard Japanese affair, with the girl asking the guy out via a bow. It's almost theatrical, with her friends hovering in the background. What all this suggests to me is the writer's intention is to show us how Rin and Asa's relationship is far more true to life than the idealized, polite idea of romance that we see in shoujo manga. Asa, in stark contrast to the young girl behind her, has no interest in bowing to Rin and asking his permission to go on a date. Instead, she pounced at his inconsideration for missing their appointment the day before. It's a simple visual, but it's a great way to start an episode in which we will see the tropes of anime and visual novels aren't generally the best way to approach a real-life romance, and it's the sort of visual play I can appreciate. Continuing on the episode's theme of light-hearted contrasts, we move on to the Operation Meeting scene. What I really love about this is if you've ever played a visual novel or been around the rom-com block a few times, this scene will be far too familiar. The one in Grizia is probably my favourite. With Sia and Nerine now realising they've lost the battle, they team up with Itsuki and Mayumi in order to plan the ultimate date for Rin and Asa to go on. It's done like a military strategy meeting with projectors and maps and Itsuki as the general. It's amazing how simple yet effective this is, as the whole audience at this point has become fully aware that Itsuki is a complete idiot, who knows nothing about real relationships or how to treat women, and yet the trio of girls go along with his plan, eventually saluting him. It's played for laughs, and it is funny, but the undercurrent here should be clear to all, that a plan like this is doomed to only fail and hurt Asa's feelings. Rin almost realises this when he suggested that Asa might prefer the cinema. This is a clear sign that he has developed, and he even goes as far as saying, "What about what I want to do?" It's fantastic that this line is here, but let's say the scene comes across as a step back for Rin, as unfortunately he hasn't yet wholly developed. In the end, going along with the light peer pressure of his comrades, rather than sticking to what he wants to do, or what Asa would prefer. An interesting point of note is the framing of the scene, in how all the other worlds sit opposite Rin, so that the scene plays as Rin, suggesting a down-to-earth idea like the cinema, opposed by a demon, a god, and an imp. It's divided 50-50 and is another nice play of literary shorthand, show the fantastical, unrealistic nature of the girl's suggestion. I also like how Shuffle almost always stays logical. Keade and Primula aren't here because, of course, they aren't. There's no way in heck Keade could handle this conversation, and Primula doesn't yet attend their school. But it also suggests something about what the girls think of Keade. They naturally assume at this point that she'd not be interested in this conversation. After all, she should presumably be around somewhere, showing how they never even pass consideration over the ramifications of Rin dating Asa. In fact, while I praise the fact that Rin has gained some degree of self-awareness, he never mentions or factors in Keade. His hubris at this point is not in his not properly acknowledging her feelings, but at his ignorance. It also reminds us that to him she's a sister, not a love interest, something that will become very important presently. Next up, we have some quickfire scenes that are worth addressing. We get to see Primula, Rin and Keade sitting in their living room, discussing Rin's impending date. As mentioned above, Rin sees no issue with this, as he doesn't take into account Kaide's feelings, which makes this scene just brilliant. Let's break it down literally, but also symbolically. Rin, sitting next to his surrogate daughter, who has conspicuously swapped back to her old attire, as if to hammer home the point that she's meant to be his kid, and his wife, brags excitedly about the date he's going on with his girlfriend. It's incredibly perverse, and I love it. Visually, we're looking at a young family having a nice discussion after dinner, when in reality, with a smile on her face, the wife figure talks about her husband's lover in front of their child. It's so wrong and borderline creepy, and yet it's taking place in what's meant to be the light-hearted episode. It's this subtlety that puts Shuffle on a pedestal for me. The more you think about scenes like this, the more you get from them. And did I mention there's no music? Yeah. No music, except for the heavily muffled TV in the background. The scene is literally helping to convey the disconnect between what the characters are saying and doing. This idea of the fantasy romance is being criticised more harshly here than anywhere else. Yet it's done, and not done in a flashy manner. At the scene's close, it's clear that only Primila understands the irony of the scene, which adds to the setup for her secondary arc that's coming. It should be noted she barely opens her mouth during the whole conversation, instead just making concerned expressions. Another quick scene is Asa picking her clothes for the date. It stands as a nice comparison to many of the other girls. Keade and Primila put fuck all effort into their clothes. Nerine automatically dresses regally, and Rin has a seemingly endless supply of Yakuza suits, but it most contrasts the Sia date scenes. As mentioned before, the Komaku scene had a deeper point about how Sia sweats the small stuff. By comparison, Asa is far more flippant about it. That's not to say she doesn't think about it, she definitely does, but it feels more natural. She seems excited rather than worried or anxious. It helps hammer home the fact that she's the most real and healthy of the girls, ironic I know, and makes a nice change of what we've seen prior. Next we have the date proper. Straight off the bat, the show delivers another quick scene to further set the tone. At the gate to Cupid Land, Asa reaches out to take Rin's hand, but he's too distracted with the elaborate plan and walks on ahead. We've seen this half a dozen times throughout the show's run, and for the most part the reaction for the girl present is to swoon and look on at Rin wistfully. But here Asa defies this convention by looking thoroughly pissed off and then pouting. It's funny, a little tsundere, but more importantly, it establishes right away in a very subtle way that a date with Asa is going to be a marked departure from what we've seen so far. It also adds further to Rin's foolish ignorance towards the whole situation. This next scene, I've simply written in my notes, Jesus Crimbo, it's Attack of the Dawn CGI, oh god, no! This is a reference to the digitally rendered go-kart ride. It's thankfully the only instance of modern CGI in the whole show, which is a mercy, as generally I think Shuffle looks really great, but I'd be remiss not to mention this one minor slip-up in the art directions part. Also, as aforementioned, we get a change to the halfway card. This refers to the ad break bookmark, which before episode 12 is simply Primila's cat plushies performing cute actions. And in the show's attempt to disarm the audience into thinking this is a throwaway episode, they dispense of the post-episode 12 card of the 5 girls posed naked, an obvious bit of symbolism to show they bear themselves mind and soul during their respective story arcs, and back to the cats. It's a nice touch as they do the same with the title card, going back to the less conspicuous green arrows. This won't be the last instance of messing with the title card, so keep that in mind if you're looking for Easter eggs during Keade's arc. We get another scene when Asa cancels Rin's plans and decides to take him on the boat trip. This expertly shows us how well she knows him, as she's already aware that Rin can't do roller coasters. In a way, this makes Rin mirror Sia's early attempt at a date in Arc 1, which we've already mentioned failed because of its unnatural pursuit of a perfect date, and Sia's pointless adherence to her game plan. All of this is to say that the audience should be subconsciously aware that what Rin's doing is going about it all the wrong way. That's the quick fire round through. Now we've got to the episode's most important scenes to look at. In keeping with things so far, they're not all that much longer, but make it clear to anyone who's what's going on for those who haven't picked up on the myriad of context clues as to what this episode is really about. So after Rin continues to perform insensitivity across the course of the date, things come to a head when Asa confronts Rin on the day's activities. She calls out their group of stalkers, in usual anime fashion. Sia, Narine, Itsuki and Mayumi come to observe and interfere, and questions Rin on his intentions. Now is the time for Rin to apologise, to own up and make amends. But that isn't quite what he does. Instead, he does something quite insidious. He tries to insinuate that things got out of hand because of the other's plan, going as far as to essentially say that he didn't want to go on a date. We know, and I believe Asa knows, that this isn't really what he means, and the problem isn't what he says, but rather what he thinks. As Asa once more astutely points out, just as she did in episode 13, Rin has been peer pressured into doing what others think is best. He hasn't gone with his plan, or what he thinks she'd like. He goes as far as to say he wanted to do something similar, but as Asa states, if that's what he wanted, then he should have done it. This is supposedly, or essentially, the same conversation from episode 13, except in that episode, sending Primila back really did seem like the right idea at the time, and so Asa didn't lambast Rin, but instead supported him. But here, what we soon realise is, unlike then, now Rin has been a dickhead. He acted insensitively, despite knowing it was wrong to do so, and that, combined with the fact he's hurt her feelings, leads to a long overdue slap. Now, when I talked on episode 13, I praised how no one slapped Rin, and I stand by that for the reasons as mentioned there. But here the slap is so deserved, and even cathartic for the audience. It's a real credit to the show that it knows when and when not to slap someone, as had this happened in episode 13, then now it would have had far less weight behind it. Rin is spiralling towards his old ways and habits from pre-episode 15, and this is just the wake-up slap he needs. With a brilliant performance from Monica Rial and some great artwork, this scene is the second lynch point for Rin's character arc going forward. With some sense kicked into our trepidatious protagonist, he retreats home to recover, and even after all that's happened, the show isn't quite done. In what follows, Keade's arc officially kicks off, and what a way to start it. We see Nerine enter the kitchen of their home, where Keade is just standing silently by the dinner table, food prepared. This scene always freaks me out, but there's some lovely clever filming tricks going on here too. For one, we get another use of the stationary, natural camera angle, showing the room which has always been drawn in order to narrow it at the far end. But with this new viewpoint, we get Keade greatly diminished in size, where Rin, standing by the room's door, looks larger, but furthermore, this helps to greatly increase the physical distance between them, even in a room this small. Next, as we're entering, we're continuing from Rin's perspective, which we've had all episode, and like we see, like him, we see a well-lit room, as, after all, the lights are on. But what follows takes a rather literally dark turn. After Rin rejects the food and goes to rest, we swap to Keade's perspective as she trashes the food. I think this simple metaphor can work two ways. One, it's a comparison for how Rin has been throwing her aside without a word since pretty much episode 1. Secondly, it can act as a representation or even a signal to the audience that the last vestiges of her sanity and self-restraint have fallen away, that her unhealthy obsession with caring for someone finally takes a complete hold, and she transitions to true yandere mode, as it were. Also, note how dimly lit the shot is. Sure, it's the inside of a bin, but the room seemed markedly bright from Rin's perspective, so why is it so apparently dark now? This is all cleared in about 5 seconds of animation, when we go to a top-down view of the room. You could easily be forgiven for missing this, but the image seems to be of Keade now standing in a dark kitchen. Except the lights are still on. The same lights as when Rin entered. Have I mentioned that this level of subtlety that I love so much? On the surface, what you're seeing is Keade staring silently into the dark, which is true, but in reality you're seeing it from her perspective. Using a simple visual lighting trick, the show is communicating the light has literally drained from her life to the point that standing in a brightly lit room, she might as well be in pitch blackness. The reason the lights were on when Rin entered? Not because she hates the environment, but because she literally didn't notice they were on. The next shot confirms this with a close-up of Keade's face. This isn't some stylistic choice. We can see lights still emitting from the very top of the screen, but her eyes have completely glazed over. All this conveyed in 3 shots that are 3 short still shots. The light has gone out of her light, fleeting, quite practically stage left. And so it begins. Listening, we're now roughly a little under halfway through our elongated journey. I hope you've enjoyed. This part's a little shorter as we go into, or dive straight into the Keade arc in the next one. So I hope you look forward to that. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Welcome back. In the previous episode we talked about episode 18 and Asa and Keade's growing developments. And it's time we really got into that. So, character focus, Keade. I know he's not mine, he's never been mine, but I need to keep loving him. Like with Sia and Nerine, the best way to examine Keade's character is via her arc, which so seamlessly acts as a character study, as well as a highly compelling and grounded narrative. Like the others, Keade is suffering from an illness, in her case an extreme form of codependency syndrome. Among mental conditions, this one's actually quite common in anime, being the usual reason for a yandere's actions. But where shows like Mirai Nikki try to make this almost acceptable and romantic, Shuffle has other ideas. As we'll discuss, this need to have Rin rely on her is all that supports Keade. We've already mentioned how her room is barren of any hobbies, and her talent at cooking is solely motivated by her need to impress Rin. She quite literally lives for him. It isn't as simple as a lack of confidence or a need for attention. She quite literally cannot live without him. To rely on her. It's extremely unhealthy and has left one heck of a mark on her psyche. But how did this happen? Episode 19 starts with hints towards the answer. In usual Shuffle fashion, throughout the show we've periodically had hints to a darker story behind Rin and Keade. From both Rin's parents and Kaide's mother being dead at the onset of the series, to Rin's unsettling dreams that we only catch glimpses of from time to time. When Keade asks about these said dreams in prior episodes, the questions came off as inconsequential, but once episode 19 starts, we realise she might have been more sincere in her inquiries. Episode 19's very first shot post the title sequence is of a young Rin and Keade standing in flashback rain. Again, I should preface by saying I'm no expert in cinematography and shot composition, but even I can take note of some really great techniques at work here. One that's super common, but highly effective, and used a lot in this arc particularly, is the distance between the two characters, as they are placed at opposite sides of the screen, but it goes a little further than just that. Keade's hair tone is dulled notably during the flashbacks, and even the illumination offered by the street lights and the shop window fronts are scaled down. This all drags our attention to the negative space between them foremost. In doing so, it accentuates the distance between them far more than just placing them far apart would have done. After your eye is drawn to the two as individuals, who you almost don't recognise as the characters we've come to know, they hold themselves in an almost limp posture, no emotion showing as they stare silently at one another, until Keade breaks the silence, striding forward a few steps, and the shot cuts to yet another great close-up. I wish you were dead. I mean it. Just die. The animation is short but incredibly sweet, with another great filter on it to slightly alter the style, and with some great quick cuts before we're back in the almost briningly brightly lit bedroom of Rin's. It's worth mentioning here about the incredibly economic way in which Shuffle covers its arcs. Nerine, Primila and Lycoris are collectively covered in just about 3 episodes as a group, with extra development for Rin to boot. Sia in 2 episodes and Asa in 2.5-ish. All in all, the show manages to give highly complete and satisfactory arcs in as small an amount of time as possible, and that to me is because of how it manages its characters. Allow me to elaborate. In most visual novels, shows, a concession is made, as it's important to understand that in most of those shows' source materials, you pursue one girl's route at a time, meaning in any VN adaptation, as each girl is explored, she is then phased out as the protagonist moves on to the next chapter. Let me be clear on this. I've got no issue with that. I love Canon and Clannad, Grizia and School Days, but I can appreciate the hustle Shuffle puts in order to hold on to its whole cast. No one is hospitalised, nobody moves to France in the last quarter, nor does the protagonist have to move away with just the chosen girl. Those examples are by no means bad things, as they benefit the stories being told, and in most cases those sideline characters will get to come back in the finale or OVA material, but there is definitely an advantage to Shuffle's method. For one, as mentioned earlier, the likes of Nerine get to keep developing in small ways during the background of others' arcs, but more importantly, it allows for the great sense of foreshadowing and natural progression that I've referenced to at length. During Primila's arc, you get multiple references to Kikyou, not in words, but through actions and animation. During episode 10's focus on Sia, you get leading lines from Nerine and even spooky moments from Keade. In every arc, you get examples of Asa's illness playing a role. The point is, by never relegating any of them out of the plot, it means each character, even if it's just in small ways, gets a great screen presence. Maybe the best example of this is episode 16's start. We see Rin and Keade say goodbye to Primila on their way to school. This is pretty much her only scene in the episode, and it's used to show how she's already developed from the previous arc, by having her wear more adult clothing. It's simple, only a couple of seconds long, but highly effective at implanting ideas in an attentive viewer's mind. What all this leads to is the natural feel of the drama that I keep blagging on about. When Kikyou manifests, it doesn't feel sudden. By the same measure, when throughout this arc, from Rin's dreams to his and Kaide's backstory, to Kaide's unhealthy tendencies growing worse, and even the subplot about Primila's neglect, none of it feels forced for the sake of drama, but rather feels like it was always inevitable, and that is by far my favourite form any drama can take. Another cousin of how this works is something we've already mentioned. This episode's title card is completely different to any other, just a simple, small line of almost logical, uncaring text. It's a neat touch, as I mentioned when discussing episode 18. I really like these sorts of little Easter eggs or references that benefit towards the main story being told or the tone of the episode in question. The next talking point on Keade is on Keade doing the washing up. Not on her face or the room she's in, but a close-up on her doing the dishes. It's a nice reminder that she's both trying to be the idealized Japanese housewife and that her work is everything to her. It's followed by another shot that mirrors many of the others we've already seen. We have Keade and Primila standing on one side of the room with Rin by the doorway. The distance between them feels like a present-day version of the flashback sequence we just saw. The once again static camera angle of the shot reminds us of the dollhouse ghostly analogue episode 6 presented for Primila, and the slightly awkward feeling of the whole thing is reminiscent of the Kikyou date in episode 17. Kaide's face is drawn minimally throughout, for what should by now be an obvious reason, and before the scenes close she steps away even further from Rin and Rimu. Primila has returned to her aforementioned post-episode 15 attire, indicating that she'll be relative and something of a supportive rock for Keade in this arc. Rin says he'll skip the breakfast that's been so prominently placed in the foreground of the still shot, as Keade steps partially off screen in what is another brilliant use of the house's architectural design. As Rin leaves, we get some more brilliant voice work from Carrie Savage, as Keade tries to hold up her composure in front of Primula. They go as far as to use the hanging racks to obscure our view of Kaide's eyes and face, adding further to this sense of her loss of control. A large part of the episode is, as mentioned, flashbacks, and one point which I really love is how Shuffle turns the normal "our parents are off on an elongated business trip for an undisclosed length of time" into a central part of its storytelling, turning that trope on its head by having the parents just literally being dead. While these flashbacks occur, what we're shown in the present day is Keade tidying and attending to other house chores on a sort of autopilot, which carries its own form of spookiness, like a grey lady. The whole flashback sequence is treated far differently from those we've seen before. In Primila's case, we were viewing her trance-like coma dreams. With Nerine, she acted as a narrator, guiding us and Rin along. But here we seemingly dispense of that, with the flashbacks seemingly being the painful recollection of memories from either Keade or Rin, or both respective perspectives. This in turn gives them a more scathing, raw feeling. The framing of these scenes almost makes us as the viewer feel like an intruder into someone's darkened mind, rather than it simply being a flashback. These flashbacks are maybe the most telling information we get on both Keade and Rin's personalities, and how they're informed by their respective pasts. We talked a little about it at the start of this essay, but the characters of Shuffle seldom fall properly into any archetypes, Rin included. In Kaide's case, her archetype is the yandere, a term coined to describe a character whom obsesses over her love interest, often going as far as to scare off or even murder potential romance rivals. As I said before, Kaide's diagnosis of dependency syndrome is also pretty on the money when it comes to being a yandere. However, keeping with the idea of her being a person first, not just an archetype, Keade ends up breaking some of the conventions of the trope. For one, she never actually kills anyone, but she definitely does go to some extremes. The obvious one is her outburst against Asa in episode 19/20, but you'd be foolish to ignore the greater extremes she goes to, straight up offering her body to appease Rin in episode 20. It's a raw scene that maybe hits harder than a normal murder scene might have, but to me this is what solidifies her as one of my favourite murderous love interests. The show doesn't feel compelled to have her commit an act she can never make up for, and that's really important. Both as an element of her character and a theme of the show, retribution and hope for a better future are integral. The actions Keade takes are incredibly immoral, as she breaks the trust of everyone she cares about most, but she never goes so far that she can't come back from it. I've mentioned it already, but as a part of the show's core, it's never as harsh as something like School Days is, where it looks to critique and take the extreme worst routes. Shuffle is more content to show an alternative. We already talked about how Sia's character revolves around coming to accept her own self-worth as a person, and the same can be said of Keade. She needs to learn to accept herself and live for more than just Rin. Her actions mean she falls the lowest of the group, but Shuffle wants to show us how even then there are still people who care about her. There's still somewhere for her to go. With that said, were it not for Primila, this could have gone a much darker path. Refer to School Days, for example. Without her then, after Kaide's outburst, there would have been, initially at least, no one there for her. Kaide's fears that she was nothing without Rin almost proved to be true, adding a wonderfully sombre layer of tragedy as the emotionally stagnant younger girl is placed in the unenviable position of being Kaide's saviour. As a character is both extreme yet highly relatable. We can all understand her feelings of isolation and her drive to be useful. Her existential fear of being abandoned again are poignant, and that's why I love her arc. Like how Sia's illness is humanized by having Kikyou be simply trying to do the best to help. By having us sympathize with Keade, the show once more tells us it's okay not to be okay. Her actions need to be condemned, but the show goes further, asking, what next after condemnation? Just casting her aside accomplishes little, even if arguably it's what she deserves. And there's the point. We're once more back to the central message of whether always doing what's morally right is for the best. Retribution is also a theme of Keade's character when talking about her backstory. After abusing Rin for literally years on end, she realises her mistake and the extent of her seemingly irredeemable actions against her closest friend and honorary brother. She takes it upon herself to dedicate her whole life to making up for it. On a narrative level, I don't think I've ever come across a better reason for a character to be so dedicated to the harem protagonist, nor have I ever seen a better explanation of the dependency syndrome yandere trope anywhere else. Quite simply, it's brilliant. To summarise, while Keade may come across as a pseudo-murderous tragic heroine, in truth her story is all about retribution and coming to love yourself. Keade could never truly be with Rin as she is, because she doesn't love or understand herself. It's a character art about acknowledging her own unhealthy behaviours and learning to move on from them, and it's an art that preaches that even at our worst, there is always some hope of retribution, always someone who will care for you, even if you don't know it or appreciate that fact. With that section of our study into Keade's character over, let's jump back into the flashback setting and have a closer look at the scene and illustrate some of the themes I mentioned in our above study. The rest of episode 19. To give a brief one of those dreaded synopses, what we witness is Keade become a completely despondent over the loss of her recently deceased mother, until Rin claims the accident was his fault, causing her to abuse him for some time until realising her mistransgressions. Firstly, let's give quick mention to Keade's hospitalisation, which, while I could be wrong, I've always interpreted this as being a manic-depressive episode. For those not in the know, certain forms of depression can cause a patient to completely stop functioning. They're not comatose as such, but it's more than simply losing the will to go on. It's an interesting depiction, and a similar event happens in Grizia, though that particular one includes PTSD for added good measure. This culminates in a hospital room we look in from the place of the door. The room is completely dark, only lit shadowily by the dim artificial light of the monitoring equipment. Then young Rin opens the door, and it lets in the light. Rin proceeds to lie, claiming the accident was his fault, and Keade's reaction is to assault Rin, attempting to strangle the child. The next shot is one I really love. It's simply that of Rin nursing his neck. In the background, we can hear a jubilant father in tears over his daughter's sudden recovery. But what we're seeing is something much more opaque. It's a running theme motif throughout the show, and maybe no more so than here, where we're watching a child's first step into an extremely abusive neglect, while the words being spoken are those of love and attention. As I've mentioned in similar scenes prior, it causes an eerie dissonance without the need for any jump scares or shocking visuals. It's also an almost mundane camera shot, and I love it. Moving along, we see this abuse carried further as we watch the two grow up. There's plenty more great uses of the house that we've come to know as a safe place being turned into one of a horror movie or abuse victim's story setting, with younger versions of Keade casting shadows over every single light source she can find. To bring up the show's wonderful use of clothes once more, I especially like how we're never given a straightforward timeline of the series of offence and furling. Instead, we can gather how much time has passed based on the clothing, namely the uniforms the two are wearing. It makes for more efficient storytelling and keeps the flashbacks from losing its tone and momentum by having exposition to explain any of this or narration hampering the unnerving feel of the scene. Instead, we just look at the uniform and we can tell they're getting older, their heights too, because they're sort of at that age. Now, and say it with me everyone, we come to another of my favourite set pieces from the show! Ha, you thought I'd say scene again, didn't you? We will talk momentarily about the decision which Rin made in deciding to take on Keade's burden, and as to whether it was selfish or altruistic. But at first, let's be a little less specific. As mentioned, Keade finds the postcard from her mother in Rin's room, revealing the truth of why she was on her way home during that fatal day, to come see an ill Keade. This crushes her as she realises just how terrible a person she's been to Rin. She rushes from the house with a lovely added detail of not having time to put on her shoes, and finds herself on a roadside. Tripping, she's faced with the same fate as her mother, an oncoming traffic accident. But this time it's different. Before a young truck coon gets the opportunity to isekai Keade, Rin reaches out. It's Rin's presence that saves her. This next bit... My cat won't shut up. This next bit is what really makes it for me. The camera fixes some ways off the side of the bridge, suspended in the air. The score plays a new variation, to the best of my knowledge. It's never played before or again. It's got an almost childlike instrumental reminiscence of Clannad's score. Never mind this came first. As the shot pulls gradually back for a decent passage of time, it is all accompanied by Keade's voice repeating the words, "I'm sorry," on loop. Aside from the obvious, this scene thoroughly hammers home why Keade is the way she is, but also why Rin could never love her as a partner. She was abusive to him for years, but more importantly, this moment cements that she's more of a troublesome little sister to him than a potential spouse. I also mentioned during the intermission that Keade's voice performance is my favourite, and here's another great example of it, really helping to accentuate this brilliant scene. So that's episode 9, only halfway through. Indeed, episode 19 is an episode that's just packed with more important details and great shots, and now seems like an appropriate time as any to make clear Primila's role in this arc. Like we've now come to expect, Primila serves more than one purpose in this part of the show. On the one hand, she's used to further communicate, or to further continue the family unit metaphor, but interestingly, like the others, as a character she's still growing. Her arc may have ended in episode 15, but real people don't just flip a switch and become fully developed. To the same extreme, Primila's development is a slow burn. I've already mentioned her change in clothing, but it's in Keade's arc that we get to see her properly changing. Her newly fleshed out personality becomes vital to supporting Keade in this arc, but her use as a child analogue certainly continues. It's something I've always thought was handled in a brilliantly subtle way. Like how Keade abusing young Rin for years on end, she's in a sense inadvertently grooming Primila. Allow me to explain a little further. In the second half of the episode, while we still see many cuts of Keade cleaning the house, we also get a few of Primila, with Keade frequently asking her to help or do certain chores. I wouldn't go as far as to say this is point-blank grooming or anything to that measure, but instead it's used to show just how dangerous Keade is if left unchecked. We've already discussed in part her attack on Asa and her prostitution stint, but I think the way Primila starts to act more and more like Keade in this arc is also very telling. Keade is having Primila do these things because she owes Rin. It's never stated outright, and that obviously isn't true, but it's a fascinating subplot that continues to add to Primila's theme of neglect. This furthers when Rin arrives home. He half-heartedly pats Primila on the head, his face obscured. If you look at Primila, she beams at this tiny modicum of attention. To us as an audience, it feels unnerving. She's becoming more like Keade. For Rin, it adds that idea that his efforts to show them more affection are only causing them more heartache. Like most of the Primila-focused scenes and moments, it's short, subtle, and highly effective. My next point is related, though probably the one I'm least confident on in the whole essay, and I'm probably just reaching here. However, we witness Rin and Primila playing a game in front of the television. This at first seems innocuous, and then comical as we realise they're playing Pong, and we wonder to ourselves what century this is. Yet throughout the scene we're shown how little attention Rin is paying to Keade and Primila, as he literally nods along, ignoring their conversation. It wouldn't therefore be surprising if they're playing the Pong game as another subliminal way to illustrate how little attention Rin is paying to either of them as they partake in the game. One could easily play, as they partake in a game, one could easily play half asleep. Heck, small detail, but the score is 4-2, meaning Primila's twice his score. I could, of course, be overthinking this particular point of interest, but the fact that everything else in Shuffle seems to hold a purpose does make me wonder about this particular Pong game inclusion, though it could have just been a cheap way to animate a TV screen. Getting a little bit closer to the definitive, we have some brilliant use of the soundscape. I've already mentioned how the OST has some original tracks in this episode, but its next trick is more quiet. We can see throughout the scene with the Pong game that Keade is stirring a pot, but we don't see its contents. However, an attentive listener will notice the sound of the spoon is scraping against an empty pan. To me, this is far more chilling than simply playing a creepy track. Instead, it's something you might not even notice till the camera cuts to reveal the truth. Furthermore, it's far less dramatic than if she was sharpening a kitchen knife, instead going to show just how blank her mind is, how clouded it's become. Following shots continue that trend as the camera simply changes angle. There's no jump cut sound effect, no major swoon in the score, rapid close-ups or shaky cam. No, instead the camera just moves to a shot of the kitchen, a shot of Keade, straight down the camera. This shot has struck me longer than any other horror shot except maybe some of the ones from Higurashi. It's not the type of shot to make your skin crawl, but instead it's just plain terrifying, and I absolutely love that. As if all this wasn't enough to show Keade becoming broken, we get Rin making one very big, very crucial mistake a couple of scenes later. He rings to tell Keade he won't be needing dinner, but what matters is his phrasing. In a moment of ultimate inconsiderate jackassery, Rin goes back on every promise he's made Keade, in particular the promise from the very first Spotlight episode, and maybe one from much earlier. So I don't need you to. The rest of the sentence is inconsequential. This is most definitely the straw that breaks the camel's back. And going back on something I said earlier, while most watching are probably realising that the shit's about to hit the fan, for some I think this scene is the one where we can really pity Keade and understand her feelings, however corrupt and bankrupt they may be. Now you'll all be glad to hear there are only 2 more scenes which I would list as favourites. That's not to say I won't still be gushing galore over the rest of what's left, but rather to put emphasis on just how good these 2 scenes are, and the one we now found ourselves at is a good contender, or a strong contender, for what I think is the strongest of them all, with only episode 12's Primula breakdown as competition. Technically speaking, Kaide's breakdown trounces Primula. The animation jumps massively in quality, and it always looks great to begin with. Additionally, the score plays its heart out as we get a distorted version of the everyday life theme. The scene also acts as the only possible climax for Keade, and it's some glorious release of built-up tension, but I suppose we shouldn't get too far ahead of ourselves. I preface this scene with the short section on Primila's role because it comes into play in a big way here. While searching for Keade, intending to apologise to her as she perceives Kaide's melancholy as her own fault, Primila checks in Rin's room only to find that Keade has blacked Asa out of a series of pictures, classic Yandere, that Rin took with her on a date. Primila's face drops, and all the while we could get interspersed cuts of Rin and Asa returning home from another day out, with Keade approaching to greet them. I love how we get the burgeoning stages of Rin and Asa's love life from Kaide's perspective as well. It's just a really great touch. Primila's reaction here is masterful. For one thing, the slow pace of her finding the photos is done expertly, and while in an actual horror movie you might find a notebook full of "kill Asa" or some such, the scribbling out pictures serves much the same purpose, but furthermore it's the importance of this being Primula. When we've been watching her develop and change more and more, she's still in our mind the mute girl who displays no emotion. This isn't unheard of in anime. Yuki Nagato would be used to much the same effect in The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, wherein if she's panicked, then you really know it's something deadly. The point being, any of the characters could have been used for this moment, putting aside why they'd be in Kaide's house. But because it's Primula, it adds one more layer of tension to an already cooked to tipping point moment, when we see the emotionless girl react with such anxiety. Further on, this also puts us in Primila's perspective, with much of the following shots essentially being shot from an onlooker's point of view, and my, what shots. First off, Asa doesn't just enter the house, she bounds in with a skip and a jump. Keep in mind that Japan is a nation of extreme politeness. Even for good friends like these, Asa's disregard for conventions as she playfully salutes her way through the front door is completely out of line, especially when we consider how conversely traditionalist Keade is known to be. With that said, I doubt this minor transgression of manners deserves what comes next. As mentioned, the animation abounds as the camera finally lifts itself from its stationary home and begins to shake violently alongside Keade, who throws Asa against the door. As we talked about, the music is a warped version of what we're most used to, and there's a plethora of filming and animation tricks snuck in here that you won't even notice till a rewatch. My favourite of these is when the camera, at a slightly awkward low-to-the-ground angle, hones in on Asa as she collapses in on herself, her illness now resurfacing once more. If you look closely, one of her eyes is actually shaking violently. It's really easy to miss, but your subconscious picks up on little details like these, making the scene twice as terrifying as might otherwise have been. As I say, I love this scene. While not narratively symbolic as episode 12's might be, the varied use of classic horror movie cinematography and enhanced animation turns this into the show's most fidelically impressive scene. I could go on lamenting its brilliance, but I think I've made my point. So, the scene fades out as we come to an episode ending, with the last point of note being that the next time is just kind of monologuing to herself, capped off by Primila's usual "join us next time" line. Simple, but eerie, and once more highly effective. This scene marks the turning point in Kaide's arc, and when we've already discussed how it isn't necessarily the worst thing she ever does, it's pretty high up there. In one action, she releases all her pent-up anger in an act that eviscerates everyone's trust. While she may not claim to have intended any harm, it's worth remembering she's well aware of Asa's illness. which has been wonderfully foreshadowed. And that is what I think the scene's biggest triumph. This is the most dramatic shuffle ever gets without the use of fantasy elements being involved. And what's great is how natural it feels. Keade isn't hitting Asa because the plot demanded it, nor does Asa's illness come from nowhere. Instead, the entire set piece is carefully built up throughout the show, making this feel incredibly wordy and far removed from the cheap dramatics of lesser dramas. Furthermore, as we've already discussed at length, when talking about Kaede's character, while this is her yandere moment, it's important that however bad it is to shove a sickly individual, this is recoverable from, feeding back into her theme of retribution. I spoke about this in my Full Metal Panic review, but it should once more be noted that I love scenes like these because of how grounded they are. Despite their reputation, rom-com and harem anime are to me some of the most heartfelt out there, without the need for a forced narrative or drama for the sake of drama, or instead presented with well thought out scenes that are grounded in human emotions we can all relate to. To reiterate from earlier, we are meant to sympathise with Keade even in a scene like this. We're meant to understand her desperation, and I think this moment does a great job of conveying that, while also being a highly entertaining yandere moment. It's an amazing production values. The end of this part. I hope you enjoyed watching. This was quite a long one, and quite a very detailed part as the Keade breakdown seems, so if it helps, feel free to read it if it didn't come across all that well in audio. Anyhow, we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Intermission 2, a short transgression into the production of Shuffle. So then, let's talk about Rin, about how he responds to what we just discussed, and about his detrimental extremist altruism, including his backstory with Keade, as well as how his kindness hurts those around him, like Primila. But first, let's take a quick moment to cool off and give credit to those who made all these impressive camera angles and frames of animation work in the first place. Well, that's what I would to say, but like so many lesser known anime in the West, it can be quite difficult to actually find much in the way of information on the legions of animators, script editors, background designers, and so on that work on these classic shows. As such, in an effort not to simply recite the trivia I did find on Google search, I'll refrain from being too elaborate on the subject. However, as context is important, let's take a little look at what I did find. First off, we have the show's director, Naoto Hoshida, who directed the majority of the episodes. It's also worth noting some of the show's episodes are directed partially, directed by others, which is an element of what gives the show its alternative styles. Aside from which, he's probably best known as the key animator, or oftentimes storyboarder on shows such as Hinamatsuri and Nagase Aratero, as well as often being a guest director for single episodes, notably the brilliant episode 15 of Gurren Lagann. His best known work here in the West is probably his role as the rector on Mirai The Future Diary, and The Devil is a Part-Timer. The Devil is a Part-Timer is another favourite of mine that's seen something of a resurgence in popularity recently, and has even had a Series 2 confirmed, some 5+ years after its initial release. It's clear to see Naoto's influence on its production, and deserving of an essay or review in its own right, but to come back to the other example, we have Mirai as a show that one is far more maligned than contentious, and for good reason. I found it to be a show for binge-watchable consumption, but to lack in great many areas of its narrative, with a lack of compelling characters. However, its directing was something I noted as quite strong during my watch of the show. As such, it was a pleasant surprise to learn it shared Shuffle as director, with some rather famous shots from the show showing his stylings. For example, Yuno is often framed with a form of shaky cam during action scenes, and the rather infamous meme of her decapitating a girl as she runs down a hillside is highly indicative of Hoshida's style of setting a camera at a stationary angle and doing an action shot in as few clips as possible. Something I can appreciate as being almost Western and in its stylings, and he's got a clear flair for using live-action filming techniques in anime productions. Takeyama Kashuko handled the show's scripts. He also worked on adapting Mirai and generally his role in most productions is adaptation. He has in this role worked on a number of more unsavoury exhibits. However, to give credit where it's due, I think he has a good sense for the pacing of a story, rarely letting them drag but always allowing for slower moments in the dialogue. Apart from Shuffle, there is nothing of real note on the resume, with the top contenders on Mal alone being him, or labelling him a living meme for his work on Big Order, Alnoa Zero, and even Boku no Pico, to which I'd agree. Shuffle seems to be the best work I've seen from him. However, I'd be happy to see more of him on less subpar shows. As for the screenplay, we have Kamitsu Hasegawa, who again isn't all that public a person despite a large body of work. His portfolio is varied, ranging from classic oldies like Blue Gender and Slayers, to a lot of kids-orientated stuff like Beyblades. I'm not familiar enough with his work to pass much comment, however I am a big fan of what I have seen of Slayers. As I've already mentioned the dub and its actors a few times, I should also give due attention to Todd Habacon, who is mostly known for his work as a solid voice actor in his own right, but on this occasion, amongst a few others, acted as the main ADR director, primarily between episodes 9 to 24. As I've already stated, I think Shuffle's deb is exemplary, and I really wish more recent Funimation dubs were of this standard. His most notable role is generally that of Natsu, the lead part in the anime fairy tale, and much like his voice acting, I think I've made it clear I enjoy his directing on Shuffle. Which was coincidentally one of the first times he acted as lead ADR director, according to his IBM page. I've lamented how more modern ADR directors and script adapters for shows like Horimiya have a tendency to go for what's trendy, or in the case of the Evangelion, dub change what isn't broken and become overly literal to the point of rigidity. With some others like the Dragon Maid and Prison School dubs even having political agenda-fueled lines included. But in Todd's case, he does a wonderful job of directing, and brings a breath of fresh air with his style that I really would love to see more often. Of course, none of these individuals would have had anything to work on without the original source material, which, as already mentioned throughout our essay, is a visual novel of the same name from Studio Navel. For those who've been around the anime community for a bit, you'll already know that in the 2000s there was a spate of visual novel adaptations that made it big, with the obvious one being Clannad and its sequel After Story. As I've already mentioned, Shuffle was one of these said adaptations, and part of what I think makes it and most VN anime great is the fact these games being adapted are complete. A factor I think we're now missing in the modern anime scene is single series completed anime. I spoke on this in my Rent-A-Girlfriend review, but it pains me to see rom-coms and harems dragged into multiple series romps more than ever before. Not that it hasn't always been an issue. The great thing about VNs is they're already complete upon release. This definitely allows anime studios to pick the best bits of these enchanting experiences and turn them into compelling and, importantly, complete productions, which is an important detail as we near the end of our Shuffle analysis, as it's an anime that's not afraid to make decisions and develop its characters. Character focus. Rin. Rin Tsuchimi is, if not my favourite, a high-standing contender for my most loved Karen rom-com protagonist. But not because I even like him all that much. He doesn't have the charm of Canon Clannad or Grizzy as witty protags, nor is he an endearingly tragic as Full Metal Panic Sosuke, or as honest as the familiar of Zero Saito. No, instead he's kind of an asshole. To dive into Rin's character, we need to look at a few elements that thankfully we've already discussed to some degree. First, Rin is altruistic to an absurd degree, which isn't an unusual trait for his type of protagonist, however is used to form integral details of his character, and informed by somewhat logical backstory. Another large part we'll hone in on is his expectations of those around him. As said at length, Shuffle isn't as critical of its genre as the likes of School Days or ReZero are, but it does share some teaming with those two, that of the pressures put on young men in culture. Rin is expected to be the man of the house. He's expected to make judgment calls when Primila gets sick, and he's hoisted with the decision to become either king of the gods or demons as early as episode 1. It's a lot of pressure for a kid. As for his actual arc throughout the show, we've already seen how much of what Rin needs to deal with is his own indecisiveness. And what he perceives as kindness often leads to greater pain for those around him in the long run. What tied closest to this theme listed above is Rin's inability to constantly go with popular opinion. He trusts the kings in the Primila arc. He tries to sacrifice himself to buy Sia time in the beach episode, and he ignores Asa's feelings on their first date. But maybe the most lasting impact of any of these acts is the one we just spoke on, becoming Kaede's reason to live. Something I love about how Rin pretends to be the reason for the death of Kaede's mother is how, while it seems selfless, and definitely is to an extent, in reality all Rin is doing is once more what he was told to do by none other than Kaede's mother, Can I ask you to look after Keade for me while I'm gone, Rin? Short, offhanded question from Miss Furo changes the course of Rin and Kaide's lives indefinitely, and is the earliest example we know of towards Rin's nature. On the one hand, you can argue what he did was right. He saved Keade in a sense. But much like sending Primila away was right, Rin's motive for doing it in some way, however small, down to the fact he no longer wished to be lonely. Looking upon the flashback scenes with this mindset adds a whole other layer to them, as young Rin keeping the photo hidden and being both physically and emotionally abused is all based on what he perceives as the right thing to do. For me, what makes his character writing so strong is how it's involved in everything he does. We've already mentioned the prime examples at tedium, but this cohesion is what makes his character a compelling story to follow. He doesn't solely save Primila, Asa, Lycoris and Kikyou do the bulk of that. He's a flawed human being, simply trying to do what seems best for what he considers to be selfless reasons, but in some sense aren't. Adding to these shows' running theme of questioning the morality of harem fantasies, even acts we at first perceive as just get turned on their head. For example, Rin acts like the normal harem protagonist, however he isn't nearly as dense. He's fully aware of the girl's feelings towards him, and the sometimes sexual nature of those, but refrains from picking any of them to save their feelings. But is that really the reason? As Itsuki kindly points out early on, isn't Rin just preventing the inevitable of making the difficult judgment call, and making it hard on all of them by leading them on? We talked before about bedrooms, and one of the interesting things about Rin's is his boat hobby. We already mentioned the traditionalist aspect of Keade and her house, as well as the game of Pong and the clothing her and Primila, post-episode 15, wear. This seems to stretch further even into Rin's room. For a boy his age, the boat is the dominant feature of his bedroom. It's indicative of someone who wants a quiet life, a simple, low-stress hobby. A hobby where he's totally in control, were it a sport, he'd have to worry about letting his teammates down, for example. But a model boat is quiet. It's rewarding in that it marks progression without any negative side effects. The boat is a great representation, not only for the passage of time within the show, but also for Rin. There's no scenes where the girls find porno mags in his room, nor do we ever see him with his computer. Rin is inverted and highly unsuited to being man of the house, or in a position to be chased by 4 women. He is literally too considerate to be unaware of the girls' advances on him, and in that sense, he really isn't dense enough to be a stereotypical harem protagonist. Some interesting stuff to keep in mind as we move forward. He is essentially a real kid, an introverted one, who just wants a quiet life, put into the position of the harem protagonist by some malicious author somewhere. Rin takes in Primila in episode 2, a seemingly harem-y trope of little significance, but in truth he does so because they expect him to, and the result is him neglecting the girl even after episode 15. He doesn't pick any of the girls because life seems easier for everyone if he keeps perpetuating the harem. He doesn't want to face the consequences of breaking their hearts, or at least hurting their feelings. The fact is, selfish or not, Rin is just too young to be making all these decisions, and I think that's the point of his character. The show is trying to talk to its primary young male audience. It sympathizes with the struggles of being adolescent, and of having society, family and friends expect so much of you, expecting you to make so many big decisions. However, it isn't solely content to be kind. Like how Asa at first talks through in episode 13. In episode 18, she slapped doing much the same thing with its audience time and time again. Episode 15 is a triumph because Rin helps put things right, but in a sense he does so, and his resolves for it comes from Asa telling him what to do. The show is literally saying its audience, male or female, not just to listen to it, but to take what it says seriously and to come up with your own answers. That's why Asa slaps him in episode 18. It's why that slap is so damn important. That's why the scene we'll next discuss over the course of the remaining 4 episodes are such a fitting conclusion to Rin's arc. Like all the characters, his development is an instant. He trips, hurts Primila and Nerine, but then gets picked up by those around him, namely Asa. Then he trips again, failing to actually be there for Sia, but improving a little by turning her down. Then he takes a step back into his old ways, acknowledging Asa's feelings and his own, but still going on a pre-planned date with her. And this is where the show slaps him. Asa hits Rin at the crucial moment, because in real life, we don't all magically do a personality 180 after a traumatic or impactful event. We stumble, struggle to learn from our past, and end up making future mistakes. This is the point of Rin. Only after this does he start to change, but even now he isn't done developing. As we discussed, he shows no consideration for Keade throughout this arc, pushing her further and further away, while all the while neglecting Primila, despite the fact he himself parallels her suffering of childhood neglect. It's the abused becoming an abuser. With the end of the Keade arc and the events of the Asa arc, as we will talk about shortly, we see Rin finally learn to move on from his previous fuck-ups. He realises he needs to give Keade space and a push to be her own person. He knows he can't be Primila's father figure, and acts truly unselfishly to save Asa when she suddenly becomes too stubborn for her own good. In the final act, Rin becomes a man, not the public toxic perception of one, but the sort he needed to be all along, the type who's there for and supports the people in his life, not because he's told to do so, or because it's right, but because it's what he thinks is best, and what he wants to do. And I think that's a damn good message to convey to your lead character in a fucking harem anime. It's true, Rin, that I think you see most clearly why I both love Shuffle and why it's so great in the first place. Shuffle to me is like Neon Genesis Ava is to End of Ava, like Lyrical Girl Nanaha is to Madoka Magica, and like Gurren Lagann is to every other Gainax and Trigger show ever made. It's got all the teaming and self-critical writing of a deconstruction, all the depth and brilliant character scripting to be a hate-filled attack on the genre it portrays, and the fans have said tropes, and that wouldn't necessarily even be a bad thing, but I love the subtlety it goes for instead. I love how it can be enjoyed as nothing more than a really well done and produced high school fantasy anime romp, but that the more you dig into it, the more you're going to get out of it. I love how Rin is both used to criticise the show's own fan base, but done so in a constructive way. It doesn't end with Rin being killed by a full-blown Keade or Yandere Keade, and while that could make for a great story in its own right, it wouldn't make for a constructive one, only a cautionary tale. Shuffle therefore instead opts to present its young audience with some vague semblance of alternate ideas for how to live life, rather than just being another said cautionary tale against otaku culture and lifestyle. Episode 20 to 21, Indelible Sin, Where Feelings Go. So, with our assessment of Rin concluded, let's look back at the rest of the Keade arc. We've gone through our exploration of Keade, Rin in episodes 18 to 19, so most of the legwork here is done. Let's start picking out a few choice scenes to break down the rest of the story. First, we have a scene a couple of minutes into episode 20. After episode 19's conclusion, we pick back up with Rin in the hospital waiting room with best girl Amma. He heads home and withdraws to his room where our object of discourse takes place. The scene itself is shot by now in classic Shuffle fashion. The camera stays fixed as though it were a CCTV angle, perched to one of the box room's walls. The lighting of the shot is once more used to great effect as well. Rin is basked only in a small modicum of dusklight, while Keade is enshrouded in, well, the dark. The point being that Keade has created such a gap between them that even if she could get close to Rin, there's no light for him left to give her anymore. He's no longer a source of hope for her. She paces forward painfully towards him, closing the distance in a rather deliberately uneasy method, before we once again get to see the use of a close-up that obscures the eyes. As we've mentioned a few times now, this is done to illustrate when a character's words don't match their meaning, but they are technically speaking the truth. Keade's eyes are off screen here as she tells Rin he cares too much for the others and ignores his own problems. It's a great use of irony, as while what she's saying isn't necessarily untrue, it implies far more to herself at this stage than it does to Rin. Keade finishes and leaves the room, walking back into the dark of the hallway. Meanwhile, the close-up of Rin's shows that they've slowly made his visage darker throughout the scene, indicative of how Kaide's comments have pushed the two even further away from each other. To finish with a rather obvious but bit of symbolism, as she exits the room, she slams the door shut to Rin's bedroom, quite literally shutting herself on the side of isolation and completing the wall between the two of them. As we've been talking about, Rin's reaction to this is important. He gets a flashback to Issei's line, as mentioned above, leaves the house and assaults a lamppost years before Taradara made lamppost cruelty fashionable. He's once more made the same mistake. By continuing to treat Keade like his surrogate wife while running off to date Asa, he's once more fucked it up. But that's not what's important for us. What matters is he realises it, because Asa's been temporarily immobilised. This time it's on him to accept it, and this time it's on him to come up with his own solution. Brilliant. The next thing to go over mirrors the last, but with some key differences. This time Primila enters Keade's room, which is pitch black. Furthermore, the camera now seems fixed to the ceiling, as though we're not just literally looking down on Keade, but figuratively, she's a lesser person. With Rin, we look at his room from an eye-level view, like an onlooker, but in Keade's room, it's as though we're judging her from above. Primila is holding the cat plushie given to her from Rin, and unlike Keade, her eyes are visible, further differentiating herself. She spits some pure truth bombs in classic deadpan lolly fashion, explaining to Keade how in truth her seemingly selfish action in caring for Rin was really driven by a selfish desire to be with him. In this, we come back to our analysis of Keade, as Primila helps us to understand how Keade and Rin both truly are, as Rin will soon admit, dependency syndrome. Usually works both ways in some senses, and that's what's happening here, as Primila puts it down. They need each other, and yet at the same time, they are completely toxic for each other. Primila goes on to demand Keade confesses her true feelings for Rin, to which she refuses, saying she's lost the right to do so, and that's what she's now going to lose Rin for good. Rimu's response is a simple one. She stands there in the pitch darkness in front of her crying, broken mother figure, and asks, "What about me?" All while holding a cat plushie, reminding us of her status as a stand-in child. As I've already gone over, in the midst of Keade's arcs, we have a subplot story about child neglect. But initially, we can take that statement two ways. Well, three if you include how darn heartbreaking it is. On the one hand, she's quite clearly saying she doesn't want to lose Rin either, as even if she's confused on whether to see him as a family or an interest of a romantic nature, you can also see it as her trying in her own unique way to comfort Keade. Despite her seemingly harsh words up to this point, Primila is metaphorically offering a hand out to Keade, to stand by her. This is what makes the scene so brilliant. Without Primila, Keade really would be alone, her worst fears realised, but in a sense her neglect of Primila is Primila's own worst fear. The point being that the two come to rely on each other, come to rely on one another, as we will soon see, as sisters, rather than the warped idea of family that they've had up till now. This scene is the beginning of them treating each other as equals, rather than parent and guardian. Or guardian and child. Like Lycoris and Kikyou, it's not solely Rin who saves Keade. In fact, I'd argue without Primila, Keade could well have become the true yandere, and we could have ended up on a bad route for sure. Continuing on with this subplot of child neglect, we have the episode's final scene. Like episode 19, it's a pretty darn packed one, though less vital. What is important in it is Primila and Rin. Rin announces independency from the free state of Kikyou, causing Keade to hit an even lower rock bottom than before. However, in the background of this affair is Primila. She's quite literally shot out of focus. After all, she's not what's important here. Her story ended 5 episodes ago. She can be put back in the box of characters. And in doing so, we get another amazingly great example of the anime embodying the story. Like the examples I mentioned earlier on, the focus is literally being taken away from Primila. Her relevance in the scene feels like an afterthought. Just like just like how Rin and Keade, she's just kind of there, like a piece of furniture, like the ghost from the earlier episode. That's not to say there isn't still some details to be gleaned from the moment, as the camera does zoom in on her, just her hands, just for a few seconds. Here we see two things: a towel which she promptly drops as it slips from her grasp, while overhearing the conversation, and the fact she's in pyjamas. What this tells us is a lot about her growth as a character. This isn't the Primila from episode 2 anymore, the emotionless, half-alive little girl. No, she's become more of a considerate person. Her clothing tells us she'd probably already gone to bed, but couldn't sleep worrying about Rin's plus Keade. And the towel rather more apparently shows how she's become more considerate, realising Rin has been in the rain umbrella-less. It's super short and simple of the scene, but exceedingly meaningful. And again, I love the way animation and shot composition are working together to greatly neglect Primila on an almost meta level. To go further, I also appreciate how Primila doesn't run off in tears like you might expect a normal child in other anime. It's another case of Shuffle sticking to its own rules, as it would be strange for Primila to act in that way. Instead, it's a far more happy with its subtle details, as mentioned. Finally, we get a continuation of the next time changing to match the situation, with the prior episodes like Keade monologuing with the final tagline from Rimu, This time, the whole entire next time is just a still, silent image. No voiceover, no visuals, nothing. The next times have become themselves a representation of Keade's mind and her declining mental state. The next episode opens in a similar fashion to episode 10 and of course episode 13's House of Twilight, and right off the bat you have some noticeable differences. For one, another shuffling has occurred, with some simple stylistic choices and filters applied in order to give the show a washed out, hazy, almost melancholy feel to it. It's done, I would think, rather simply, yet it has the effect of adding a whole new other colour palette to the show. Not for the first time, and it's one of the great additions to the visual appeal. It's not quite inverted, but gives a similar effect to that, which, as mentioned, I love this form of using the animation in suggestive ways to tell the story without words. It's an exceedingly hard effect to replicate this well in live action, but for anime it's almost the ultimate form of show don't tell, which can often be something the visual mediums struggle with to a surprising degree. Following this we have another great moment. It's not that outstanding of a scene compared to the others we talked, especially considering your attention is mostly still on the colour palette filter change, but the significance of the scene is what makes it work so well. We have Rin, Sia and Nerine in the park. The same one from episode 13, where we witness Asa guide Rin in his more dramatic moment of need, and where Kikyou led Rin in episode 17. The trio sit on what is presumably the same bench as the aforementioned Asa scene, and really all Rin does is vent to the two other worlders. The scene in itself is a subversion. Far too often I've made the adage that the inclusion of the two girls indicates the intentions of a scene being fantastical, but here we go back on that a little. Nara and Sia have developed. They've begun to move on with their lives, and while they're still interested in pursuing Rin, now it's for their own reasons and not due to survivor's guilt or a lack of self-worth. As such, you expect this scene to be the two of them talking Rin into the right path like Asa did prior, but you know what? They don't. Sure, they mirror episode 13 in that they sit quietly and listen to his grievances, but this time Rin finds the answers by himself. What he realises in this conversation is a really lovely message too. It isn't harsh or cruel in spite of all Keade's done, but instead it's simply honest, maybe even a little self-deprecating. We were mistaking comfort for happiness. I love this line so much. It's quaint, not dramatic. And while I do love a dramatic scene with the MC crying as he runs to find the heroine in the final act, to me this is perfect for the story Shuffle wants to tell. Here Rin admits his faults. It's not Asa or Keade pointing them out. He's admitting that he was living a life as it was living life as it came to him, via the path of least resistance. But the boy still isn't finished. He goes on to thank Sia and Nerine, telling them that through their struggles he was able to see himself, able to see what like they are, to see that like them, he too and Keade needed to move forward with their lives. As he draws the parallels to Sia and Narine's own struggles and needing to let go of their sisters, while Rin and Keade need to let go of their shared past. He's learning from their mistakes and progression. This mirroring of arcs is not only justification for Nara and Sia to stick around in the story for the show's whole running time, but is also like a, well, shuffling of the seats. A final note is another small but appreciated detail. Like Keade not having time to put her shoes on during the flashback sequence and the climax on the bridge due to the nature of her flight, at the end of this scene we see Rin murmuring about the high cost of rent in the city. Now, I'm confident an earlier version of Nerine or Sia would have offered to pay the rent for him, or to get him a job in their mansions, or just straight up have offered him a home there, maybe even having some sort of comical struggle over the matter. But these versions of the two girls have moved far past that. They've developed to have more respect for both themselves and for what Rin's trying to do, and as such they simply cheer him on in his endeavour, just like any supportive friend would do. They don't offer him money, they don't offer him a job, they just support him. And that's some pretty good progress in both their characters and a way of showing the more serious nature of the later writing. We have a couple smaller moments interlaced into the greater story. We have a scene of Keade wandering, culminating with her on a high river bridge. Her attire is even more dreary than normal, with a darkened colour palette. Prior to this we have Primila rushing to tell Rin and the others about how Keade has gone missing. Immediately her panicked attitude and demeanour, along with the framing of the whole episode, or even the whole arc, put two exceedingly unsettling thoughts into her mind. Is she going to attack Asa again? Or does she have something more self-destructive in mind? Cutting back to our bridge shot, we hear footsteps. There's both a wave of relief as we presume Rin has arrived, but also one of intense dread. On the one hand, we know she's probably safe from suicide now, but there's still the possibility she'll try and kill Rin. But then all those fears are dashed as we realise it isn't Rin. Part of what makes the reveal nice is how we as the audience expect it to be Rin, probably as much as Keade does. That's how it's framed. Her mind is shattered, but it's doubtful she expects Asa any more than the rest of us do. With Asa now here, the two retreat to the side of the riverbank. Interestingly, this is another location we visited a few times, one notable occasion being when Rin rejects Kikyou here. Speaking of this scene, aside from being wonderfully mature for any anime, regardless of the harem tag, it also helps to heavily mirror Keade's arc to the other girls, with Asa now taking on the big sister role that Kikyou and Lycoris filled in earlier arcs. As Shuffle is a show with strong emphasis on the role of family within life, along with the significance of found family, I think it's only fitting how pivotal the three older characters are to the individual story arcs. That this scene also has some just gorgeous imagery and symbolism. Alongside the more saturated colouring of these moments, we have Keade and Asa almost looking like they're dressed for a funeral, which is only emphasised by the flowers in Asa's hands, whose red colouring acts as the unreal splash of flavouring on screen, making them pop and draw the eye, more so adding to the funeral imagery, which at first seems sad. However, the flowers act on the three rather important and separate guises. For one, there's the literal meaning of them as an apology. Secondarily, they emphasize or they symbolize death. But of what? Well, in reality, while the whole scene conjures the thought of a sad funeral, really it's the end of Keade's self-harming lifestyle and her movement into living for herself. As such, the flowers take on a third meaning, as a symbol of Asa congratulating Keade on her potential to be a truly brilliant person, a gift from one best friend to another. I also love how large amounts of this conversation are done with little to no music whatsoever, with just the sounds of the pouring rain in the background, until Keade says it. I wasn't good enough to make him love me. It's not that surprising. Some of the awful things I did shouldn't be forgiven. It was all I cared about. Everything I did was for Rin. It was the one thing I could do to try and make up for what I'd done. But then, after a while, I realised what I really wanted was for him to fall in love with me. I wasn't honest with myself. Everything I did was because I wanted to be with Rin. Really, I could just put in this whole conversation in here, and I don't really know how to express my love for it without incomprehensible gushing. For one, it's framing, where Rin realization and dedication are done in the sunlit of the picturesque park surrounded by friends. Keade's confession is on a windswept riverbank in the pouring rain, facing her romantic rival. Where Rin is looking to the future to try and make things better, Keade is wallowing, drowning as it were in the past. This scene is truly heartbreaking, as Keade further breaks down, wishing to see him one last time, just so she can keep on loving him. She pours out all her feelings here in an act that forever cements her as one of, if not the best, childhood friend character in this or any other medium, and I absolutely love it. Even as the scene goes on, there's still this lingering fear in your mind that Keade will flip out and try to drown Asa or some such in the states, or as she states in classic yandere, who's already gone over the edge fashion. It makes sense though. I can't blame Rin for choosing someone like you over someone like me. As she says it, the flowers fall from Asa's hand in a wonderfully animated fashion. The music changes and the tension goes. It's a full release. It's over. You realise that the show has no interest in spoiling everything with some shocking murder scene, like we talked about in our analysis of Keade. Even after all this, at her lowest moment of all, there's still hope. Hope of retribution. So I guess it's your job to make him happy now. Good for you. And Asa, I know that you love him, but I'm so sorry. We move past this to watch the four other primary members of the group out searching for Keade, unaware of her revelations, and break down into her best friend's arms. We get nice quick shots of Rin's centre walking down the roadway. It's framed very similarly to the flashback dreams, but with a square focus on just him, plus it's obviously the present day now. And there she is. He offers her a handkerchief and asks her if she's okay, and the two finally have a conversation. It's beautiful because really, this is their first genuine talk they've had in like the whole show. No masks, hypocrisy, dramatic irony, or pretending to play house. Instead, they finally converse properly, with Rin demanding Keade listen to him, proclaim his feelings for Asa, not out of malice, masochism, or cruelty, but so that she can understand that he still always loves her, that he'll always be grateful for the cushioned lifestyle she afforded him for years of his life, and that she has the opportunity to go forward and be so much more than just his Japanese housewife.
Now
hold on, that isn't fair. You need to hear this from me, right now and from no one else. Again, I could just copy and paste the whole conversation into here. Please don't love me. Please don't.
Sorry.
I don't know how I'm supposed to. I love you so much.
Love me.
Aside from some brilliant voice acting, the two hug, and this is to me the best genre resolution I've ever seen. And as the two walk away from one another, the episode still isn't finished just yet. I made stew because I figured you'd probably be cold and hungry, and stew's good for that. Okay, you make it better, but I want you to have some. We're going to talk about this a lot more as we finally reach our character analysis of Primila. But in this moment, we watch as arriving home, Keade finds Primila has made her stew and prepares her a towel. This is what I alluded to earlier. In this moment, Keade realizes what Rin already has, that the world hasn't ended, that she isn't alone, but instead there are still people who love her. I especially like how the scene frames it to make Primila, in her more adult attire, appear to be taller than Keade. After all, despite the neglect, Primila has kept growing as a person in all this time. Well, Keade is just starting on that journey. In a way, what the 3 episodes that make up or form the main crux of her arc lead to isn't the amazing discourse between her and Asa, or the hug from Rin. It's this moment here, quiet and short in her own home, like a certain relevant someone we know, where Keade realizes how much more than just Rin she has to live for, and to me that's incredibly wonderful. Shuffle may at times have to sideline some of its characters out of certain episodes, but right here in episode 21, we see the show give further closure to Nerine and Sia, a new beginning for Primila, the final stepping stones to set up for Rin and Asa, plus the climax of Kaide's arc, and to me that's mega impressive. This episode ends, for the first time in a bit, not on a cliffhanger, but a reward. We see this in episode 17, where it ends in a reward for Sia, but here it's Rin's reward. In fact, as we'll soon address, almost all of episode 22 is. We get to watch Rin finally confess his feelings for Asa. I quite like how they're already dating at this point. Far too many anime make the consummation of the leads becoming boyfriend and girlfriend out to be some massive deal, but here that's borderline breezed past off screen. We already mentioned the not so shallow allusions to this all the way back in episode 18. Because of this, the two confessing love for one another actually comes across as quite real, sincere even. The anime doesn't end with the two of them hook up, nor when they admit they're convicted of the L word. No, instead, we truly understand what love means to these characters, whether it's Primila's cat dolls, Nerine and Sia's need to love themselves, or Rin and Kaide's shared familial love. This confession is something we understand, and rather than that devaluing it, it makes it into something far more special, to me at least. There are some other nice details here. Also puts me out of a job by drawing the parallels between her dismissal of her mother and Kaide's abuse of Rin out to the audience, with Rin and her having a really open chat, which helps to further these two's believability as a real couple of real individuals in spite of their fictionality. Rin even admits to her how hard his past was, but how much you can endure for a family member you love. Furthermore, the shot composition is just lovely. It should be noted that after Rin and Keade literally hug it out, the art style resumes usual business hours and goes back to normal. Also notice the time segment also returns to being the less stressful, on my heart, normal version. The episode is rounded out on this confession, and a truly classic anime kiss to rival even the greatest among its contemporaries. That'll do for this part. And my apologies if my delivery was a bit stilted this week. It's the first time I've recorded since Christmas, but I hope you enjoyed anyway, and the written version is always available via mail. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. Welcome back. Character focus, Primula. At last we come to our penultimate character study, and probably our penultimate episode. Knowing where to place Primila in this essay was a little tricky. For one, I maintain that she's in truth the main core of the anime, in that she mirrors each character's struggles in some way, and straight up narrates the final episode's epilogue. Furthermore, her arc forms the show's main climax and action set piece in episode 15. With all that said, putting a focus on her too early would require describing a great deal of scenes we had yet to reach, and that is something important. Primila never stops developing throughout the course of the show. It's what makes her a great and highly engaging character. I've chosen to place her exploration here as her role in episode 22 can be baffling for those who haven't been paying attention. Plus, we've covered the bulk of the steps towards her development now. As I mentioned quite some time earlier, way back in episode 6 for that matter, Primila pays homage to many of her predecessors in more ways than one. Coming back to the narrator idea, this is quite a prevalent trope in older anime, wherein the youngest character takes the role of narrator in some fashion. Heck, even in the West, things like the dub of Digimon made Kari the narrator. This is, in my view, to do with the idea of the youthful pair of eyes, the adventurous escapist spirit that the shows are often marketed towards, with an air of the unreliable narrator to top it off. Rather famous examples of this would be Rory in Martian's successor Nadesco, who goes on to be the lead character in the much maligned follow-up movie. Rei Ayanami in Evangelion takes this role in a way only Ava could have come up with. And within the years to come, shows like Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya would do much to the similar effect with Yuki Nagata. Aside from this making for a nice reference to other properties, or how it's a neat to call out Primila's parallels to her fellow cast members, it plays a more important role when looking at her character. She by far develops the most of all the characters, being almost unrecognisable by the end, and this is because she starts at ground zero. Primila is deliberately a small, mute, blank child at the series' onset, so of course her many struggles would have the most impact on her. As such, when we talk about Primila, her core tenets of development are that of growing up, the struggling of fitting in during adolescence, the themes of neglect paired with found family and feelings of a lack of self-worth. Like with Rin, we've already discussed most of this, so it's more a case of pulling all the strands together now. Child neglect we've most recently touched on. It's a topic the show rather appropriately handles as a B-plot. We see it during the first arc, and biggest early indicator to it would appear to be when Rin discovers Primila's lack of undergarments. However, arguably this is a theme introduced in the girl's very first on-screen appearance. As early as episode 2, we witnessed Primila simply wandering the rainy streets of the town. With retrospect, it's clear by the gods' reaction that she was wandering off on her own accord, while later they imply they possibly let her escape in order to meet Rin as something of a social experiment, another interesting example of the manipulation directed towards Primila. The fact is, she's clearly someone who has the mentality of a child, lightly dressed, wandering the streets of a strange location under a strange sky. There's something else to be gleaned from her initial scene too. Rin doesn't obtain her the plushie from the claw machine. I love this detail as, even in her first moments of spotlight, Rin is letting her down. It's not really his fault, but it plays heavily into her character. No one cares. She's always the neglected child. Further in her backstory, as discussed at some length prior, the demons created her not to be unkind, but because if she dies during experimentation, no one would mourn her. On their part, it does suggest some remorse for what they perceive as the death of the first test subject during the first Infinite Magica experiments. However, what's key to us is the fact that her creation was a result of a need for someone who was both malleable and disposable, but ultimately was done out of a strange form of kindness. Even now we're not done. Next we have Lycoris. Again, we've already discussed her prior, but the point is, despite being the only one to show Primila any real kindness during her stunted childhood, Lycoris eventually chooses to save her sister Nerine, and in doing so she abandons Primila, her kindred sister, to a life of isolation and loneliness. This comes to what should be ahead in the Keade arc, where we see Primila's depravity in the background of the Furio arc. However, something interesting here is the resolution to it. Primila in this arc is the one who always is there for Keade, not the other way around. There's no real moment where Keade or Rin apologizes to Primila. Instead, she gets up on her own 2 feet and tries to rectify the situation by herself. This proves to be a more common motif for her than you might think. After all, she followed Nerine into the real world, under her own agenda to see what the man that Lycoris loved was like. Primila acts, to the best of her abilities, to be an independent, repeatedly. This is added to by the fact she isn't a member of the harem until around episode 22, but is still a primary cast member, which puts her in a peculiar position by rom-com anime standards. Past her neglect, we have her struggles to fit in. This applies to her lack of humanity, her absence of family, and her totally empty reservoir of self-worth. Rather than pointing out again how this parallels the others, let's reacquaint ourselves with how it affects Rimu. She is for all intents and purposes speciesless, not human, not wholly demon or god, but some kind of hybrid machination. This proves quite the struggle for her, as she's created absent of any real personality, and her attempts to make connections end in heartbreak. This leads us to an interesting aspect of her character, the deconstruction of the Lolita archetype. I preambled about this somewhere near the top of the essay, but I don't think Shovel is a deconstruction anime, but rather that it has elements of the genre, and maybe nowhere more so than in Primila. Putting aside her characterization for a moment, on a meta-narrative level, the show seems to be saying quite a bit with her presentation, like how the Lycoris backstory makes Narine's reason for liking Rin a more valid one, or how the show turns the old parents away on a business trip into a major narrative role. Primila is given some fairly heavy reasons for existing the way she does. The idea of the deadpan lolly being as such because of a grim backstory is not uncommon, but Shuffle is definitely an interesting example of it because of the meta implications. Referencing Nadesco's Ruri again, she's deadpan because she's an AI interface, as confirmed to us almost immediately within that story. So it's definitely not new, but what is the way it's used to explore lolly culture. We've mentioned at length how Primila's clothes change to match any given situation. The same can be said with how she's drawn. Depending on the tone of the scene and the artist at the helm, Primula is often depicted with longer legs or a more pronounced chest. Conversely, the inverse occurs frequently as well. This is another one of the show's use of animation abuse. In the real world, changing the proportions of a woman would be tricky and needlessly expensive to do justice, but here it can be done with ease. But why, you might ask? Well, one of the questions Shuffle asks its otaku audience is, what about these archetypes is it that you like? Do you like that Keade is dedicated to the point of desperation? Do you like how Sia flaunts her body despite her lack of self-confidence in her personality? Do you like that Primila is childlike? To say it again, the show isn't so much criticising you as it is trying to get you to ask yourself these questions. If you're a Lolicon fan, then why? The aesthetic, the age, or maybe the personality? It can seem foreign nowadays in a time where lolly characters appear to be getting progressively smaller, more childlike and worryingly incestual. But back in the 90s and 2000s, lolly had a different meaning. A fan term coined based off the Russian book Lolita. Lolly didn't necessarily describe a child, though it could. But because the word child already existed for that, instead it described an aesthetic of character. Somewhat unique in that other fan terms like tsundere we use as shorthand for an anime personality, lolly refers to an aesthetic choice. As such, the 2000s in particular are known for a whole host of iconic lolly tsunderes. Taiga, Louise, Nagai, Shana, Nagisa, Ayu, and Shinobu's Rika, along with most of the cast of Higurashi, are just some of the leading same-age lolly roles that spring to mind. However, the term back then didn't refer to children, as some have appropriated it to mean in more recent times. This is in itself alone makes Primila's depiction even more interesting, as the questions she's asking seem more relevant now today with modern lollies than ever before. Primila isn't here to judge her fans. Much like the others, she's here to help, mostly young men in this case, think through some rather complicated adolescent feelings of wish fulfillment. The show isn't trying to paint you as wrong for liking the idea of Primila or Keade, but instead wants to convey how damaging an ideal that might be for the girl in question. There's nothing wrong with fantasizing about a perfect dere housewife, but what's important is that you remember that vision would in reality be a person with their own feelings and emotions, and that's what leads us to the point of Primila's more deconstructive side. What would a lolly be like in real life? The show gets you to consider the terrible events that would make someone that deadpan and emotionless. It points out their lack of common sense and their feelings of worthlessness. That idealized vision of purity would in reality be just a girl trying to fit in. However, as we've mentioned, Shuffle is never content not to offer an alternative, and as such we see Primila change over the course of the series. It's crucial that she only considers herself romantically attracted to Rin in the final act of the show, because only then is she a fully fledged person. The show is saying it's fine to find a fully consenting person of your own age appealing, but that you must look past the idealized idea of that person, to identify if what you're looking for or aiming for is something healthy for everyone that's involved. Like the others, Primila is painted in many different lights. Some people like the idea of a weak partner who can be rescued, yet Shuffle points out just how much damage that does to a person. I already mentioned the effects of being emotionally vapid, and the idea of the ideal family unit is brought heavily into question. The show isn't trying to judge anyone. It isn't going around calling people pedophiles or other hollow buzzwords and rhetoric. It's simply asking you to consider the often harsh reality behind the fantasy. That is, in the sense, the core element of the whole show, and all its fantasy allegories, whether they be to do with the cancerous sicknesses or the lollies. It's another reason why Primila acts as the show's heart, by being the most representative of this idea. My apologies if this segment feels more rigid in tone than the rest. To my own shame, I find myself a little fatigued with the topic of Lolita and shoujo depictions in anime at the moment. For those reading this as my first piece of work, off the back of the recent fractures the inspired trend chaser of a YouTuber, Noralities, has perpetuated, I found myself experiencing firsthand the intolerance of modern anime discourse, and being rather rudely awakened to the fact that some perfectly logical and intelligent, analytical even, people will dismiss an entire anime production for the inclusion of a lolly or a shoujo. The idea that normal, reasonable people are so intolerant to even having a civil discussion about these awkward topics without the use of shallow rhetoric like pedophile has been genuinely really quite disheartening. So it is with my utmost apologies that this segment isn't my best explained. Primula has always been, for me, one of the best written parts about Shuffle. Despite a small enough screen presence, she's a complex and highly developed character, used to deliver a variety of good messages, both meta and otherwise. If you have an interest in more of my thoughts on this matter, you can read my Super Lovers review here on Mal. A slightly earlier version of this is also available on the Mal blog page. Thanks for understanding. Moving away from how, the depiction of what can be seen as harmful things like Lolita and Shuffle Shota can actually be used to help young audiences work through strange and complex sexual desires and fantasy fulfillment, let's get back to Primula's development, which isn't a straight line. She starts fragile but determined to find Rin. Then she attempts to resist returning to the demon world but gives in for Rin. Keade and Narine's collective saves. Then she finds herself a family, only to follow that by once more being neglected, as she makes desperate attempts to appease an increasingly uninterested Keade and Rin. Nonetheless, she perseveres, eventually becoming Kaide's rock and forming herself into a fully fledged person. This growth she undergoes is wonderfully charted by the smaller moments. Her clothes, her cooking, and her consideration for others all change in small ways throughout and by the time of episode 22. Primila has finally begun to think for herself. The lessons she learns from episode 15 come to fruition. Indeed, episode 15 teaches Primila that despite the betrayal that Rin and Lycoris pertained, she is loved by them both. It's another part of what's important, that it's not just Rin who saves her. And then through witnessing Kaide's struggles, she learns that in turn, there are people who need her, that she can be the Lycoris Keade needs in that moment. It's only through this continued development that Primila comes to appreciate what it means to be a human, that we all mess up and hurt one another, that we all do our best to support each other. It's once more a simple message, but it's only with this learn that she can move on. She has to first learn what love is in order to be in love. Like we discussed with Rin and Asa's confession scenes, a large part of Rimu's journey is to learn what love is. Lycoris conveyed it to the girl with first the cat plushie, something which Rin would go on to reinforce with the second toy. And while this is a good way to explain it to a child, Primila needs to learn to appreciate it on a deeper kind of love, in order to develop into a more fully fleshed out person. She first learns heartbreak when Lycoris dies, and when Rin betrays her trust. But what she sees in episode 15 is how affection goes further than physical objects like teddy bears. But in standard Shuffle fashion, Rin has little to do with her learning curve. Lycoris started it, but Keade finishes it. After all, it's through Keade that Primila comes to understand the difference between familial love and romantic love. This is why a fully developed Primila in episode 22 is capable of showing jealousy and envy towards the other girls vying for Rin's attention. She's no longer just a child, something which episode 24 confirms in a very literal sense, by giving us the information that she was always only a year or two at most younger than the rest of the cast. The point being that it was a question of her understanding the world that made her attraction to her immoral... It was a question of understanding of the world that made attraction to her immoral, not her age. When we speak of these things, age is almost never the important thing to discuss. To include our analysis of Primila, I actually find it quite hard to narrow down what exactly the message being conveyed by her character is. Where you can boil the others down to one overly simplistic sentence, Sia needs to love herself, Nerine needs to live for herself, Keade can find retribution, and Rin needs to learn the difference between what's right and what's right, Primila is a little more opaque to disconcert. One reading could be that no matter your background, you can still aim to make the best of your life. Another might be to understand that even when you're neglected by the people you love, they may still care for you. One could look at the meta elements and say the breakdown of the lolly genre is the message, or that it's a heartfelt metaphor for the struggles of growing up as a teenager, while trying to fit in, but being a little bit different. It could be one of trying to affect the changes in your life that you'd like to see in others, or maybe it's as simple as a message about growth. A combination, in a sense, of all those prerequisites, telling us that no matter the background, your individual struggles and shortcomings, no matter how many times you've been hurt or burned, you can still become a great person, still go on to be better than you once were. A message, if you will, about how we never stop changing and growing, as people in the best possible way. I personally have very little affinity for lolicon culture or lolly waifus. I don't really play the waifu game, but if I was asked who the best written lolly is, my mind will always arrive at Primila in quick succession. The extent of topics and morality conveyed by her is highly compelling, while still managing to have her be comic relief early on. She's a well-written character with some great intentions for the show's audience, and for that she may just be my favourite character of the whole show. Episode 22, A Bountiful Dream. As I alluded to in a previous segment, episode 22 can come across as a bemusing experience. The fan service is cranked up to 11, and the tone returns to that of the opening moments of the show's first few episodes. We get a return to the visual novel character bubbles, sound effects and all. Sia, or more precisely Kikyou, is extremely sexual, and Primila and Nerine don cat cosplay. As I also implied, the easy answer for all this is it's the reward. Rin's reward for actually manning up somewhat, for doing the best thing he could think of with the Keade situation, and later making sure to give her closure while still trying his best to show his more brotherly affections before finally confessing his love to Asa. However, we can go a bit more in depth than just that, with a return to the quick-fire scenes game. For one, we have the opening scenes, for example, which automatically confers this is going to be a lighter episode when we witness Rin receiving back slaps aplenty from fellow students. It's a nice gag, but also serves to both reflect how much further Rin and Asa's relationship has become, while also it reminds us of the simpler times when Asa used to greet Rin with a similar slap on the way to school. The same scene also acts as a return to the aforementioned character bubbles. What follows on from this is a series of fluffy classroom scenes. It has been a while since we spent any significant time in the school. I quite appreciate the rather lengthy scene of Isuki, Mayumi and Rin simply chilling in the cafeteria. It's a nice reminder of these three's pre-existing bond from before the series opened, and furthermore, Isuki affords a nice moment of clarity when he compliments Rin in making the adult choice and choosing, respectfully, the one girl he actually felt romantically towards. The scene is also pretty funny, with Mayumi delivering a wonderfully animated punch while showing surprisingly good form. Something that isn't even a full scene but is worth quickly mentioning. Set cuts display Nerine and Sia quaintly spending their lunch break with a separate group of friends. It's a nice touch and an easy way to communicate to us how the duo are moving further away from their infatuation with Rin, being their only motivation. My apologies, my delivery ain't great today. Next up is some great relationship building. People often praise shows like Golden Time for its portrayal of relationships that go further than the will they won't they phase. And I recently reviewed Horimiya, a show which was flaunted for much the same trait. However, here in Shuffle we get the same to very little fanfare. In the current scene we see Asa and Rin happily spending time together in Rin's new apartment. Rin mentions how easy life's been up till now. It's a nice level of self-awareness considering how, to some degree, one would argue his life has been awful. But what he's accepting here is how easy Keade has made it for him in more recent years. I also appreciate how Asa never offers to help with the money situation. After all, that would devalue his efforts and the weight of his independently made decisions. The scene is rounded out with a casual kiss, and casual is the important word there. In spite of Rin looking initially surprised, we get the impression that this is becoming a natural part of their lives, showing just how comfortable a partnership they have become in each other's company. There are a few shows that pull this off. Offhanded kisses all that well. There are a few shows that pull off offhanded kisses all that well, but here we have a great example of one doing just that. Next is one of the episode's only slow scenes, as we watch Keade and Rin talk for the first time since the previous story. The implication of time passing between episodes 21 and 22, but it's clear Keade is still bent out of shape, as Shuffle once again refuses to let her simply be fixed the moment her arc ends. This conversation is one of the show's most mature and ends in another quiet hug. Despite the episode's focus on the over-the-top fan service, the show is never foolish enough to extend that lightheartedness out as far as Keade. This scene just proves how much more tactful it is than that. There's also some great voice acting by Kaide's voice actress. Now we come to the last big talking point of the episode, that final scene. To give context, Rin and Asa stand in a new apartment, looking out on the view of the town. The balcony door is open, which gives the scene a brilliant use of visual storytelling. Rin is framed behind the open glass door. As such, the clouds and the dusk skyline reflect across his visage. For him, life is now great. All his friends have found their answers and are on the path to recovery. He himself has found a new road to walk along, while meanwhile he's now with the girl of his dreams. His life is literally clear skies now. He's taken responsibility in his life, and all this episode has been his reward. But then, even now, we still have those unassuming clouds on the horizon, foreshadowing what's left to come in the show's remaining screen time. In stark contrast, Asa is framed by the open doorway, completely obscured by any clouds or sky of any kind. Representation of how her struggle is only just beginning, and reflective of how, despite how close they seem in physical proximity, they are still divided, and the hardships of life are actively vying to draw them apart. Like how the glass door frame standing between them literally separates them in the framing of the shot. Episode 22 heavily mirrors episode 12 in that we witness what seems to be a good end, a harem end even. Everyone has reached a relative point of equilibrium, but like with Primila once before, Asa falls foul to an almost identical illness. The last point is interesting. It plays into the point of this episode heavily. The conflict of Primila's arc was Rin's fault, in a sense all along, with that of Primila's illness, but this time Rin has done nothing wrong. He's done his best, done what he believed to be right, is trying to support his friends in a more productive manner, and to be a good boyfriend to Asa. And yet in the end she still falls ill, and that's part of the point. I compared Primila's sickness to the simile for cancer earlier on, and here we see that come back once again. In a manner of speaking, Asa falling sick is very true to life. Even if we do everything we can to help those around us and to be a good person, even if we beat the cancer once, you can never know when it will cruelly return, unannounced, untimely, and uninvited. It's all the more painful because of the fact that Rin has finally done the right thing. Primila breaking felt like an inevitability, but Asa, while equally is down to no one, it's no one's fault that Asa's ill, we feel as powerless as Rin is about to become. This mirroring of episode 12 is present in more than that, however. Like 12, we see the happy end portrayed in a slightly unnatural way. Sure, it's less tragic and the characters have worked through most of their issues, but there's an intentional dissonance in how obtrusive the fan service is. The characters come off like they're in a classic harem. Kikyou acts like a true sexual deviant. Primila, though true totally in character, can come across as out of character. And even Nerine seems out to impress Rin. Sure, things have moved far past episode 12, but we still aren't quite there. This is still a fantasy, and episode 22 does an amazing job of displaying that fact to great, if not a little confusing on the first watch, effect, while also never stepping out of line. Keade is still recovering, Primila is still finding her personality, Nerine and Sia are shown developing outside of the main group, and despite all the tumultuous fan service, even in the most intentionally lustful of episodes, the show never uses nudity as a joke. Not one nudity shot is used in this episode, despite it being undeniably the most fan-servicey episode. So now maybe it's time we properly address that final point. Team, maturity in nudity. Now, here's a topic I first addressed right back at the start of this elongated essay. Let's take a moment to put on our schoolboy analysis writing skills and tackle this team head-on rather than in my usual roundabout manner. As the theme of the story, it's one thoroughly grounded in Japanese culture, whose perception of nudity varies greatly from our own versions of it over here in the bulk of Western countries. For one thing, censoring nudity is a relatively new concept to the country, only becoming a regulation post the year 2000, which stands in a marked contrast to our own Ofcom standards boards and the likes of them. For an easy example, just watch older anime, and you'll be surprised how often a child or even a fully grown woman is in, say, a Gundam series will be suddenly naked for a few seconds of shot. Not even for the purpose of fan service, mind you. Gurren Lagann makes something of a meta joke about this, with a whole mini-episode of the spin-off series Parallel Works being dedicated to a naked version of a young Dari. This all stems from an expectation, one that all upstanding citizens should hold the naked form in a sense of sincerity and reverence. Something which, in the last couple of decades, the Japanese government finally seems to have realised might be a misplaced trust in their idealised image of humanity. So apparently adept at personal responsibility, but nonetheless makes for an interesting part of anime's history. For our purposes, on the other hand, we have Shuffle's frequent use of nudity, and is indeed regular, not to the level of something like High School DxD. Indeed, I'd almost hesitate to put an ecchi tag on the property were it not for the nudity scenes. Yet, as mentioned, at large, Shuffle never uses these scenes for titillating fan service. Instead, when a bra is lost, we as the audience are expected to acknowledge and be mature enough to realise that it's a signal for us to pay attention rather than to be aroused. It might seem like a foreign, contradictory concept to many of us, but nudity is such an important part of all our lives that Shuffle expects any display of it to make you consider its secondary meaning. Maybe the best way to illustrate this is with some examples. Of these is episode 11, just the whole thing, to be honest. We've already only glossed over it so far, but during the course of the episode we follow Mayumi and Miss Mao as they go on a heavily fan service-filled mini-adventure. On the surface it acts as an icebreak in between the more sombre episodes 10 and 12, and as a cushion before the show takes on a regular darkened subject matter in general. This alone is something I love, especially as it gives time to some characters who are somewhat less served in the anime than their visual novel counterparts might have been. But there's more at work here from our perspective. The plot of the episode is mainly Mayumi in specific, losing her underwear and her mission to both work a shift in a maid cafe and then to recover said undergarments. This is not only the show's most complicated plot. This is not the show's most complicated plot. However, despite the prime opportunity to sneak in some grotesque opie shots, it never does. In fact, despite a myriad of softcore shots, the only nudity comes right at the end of the episode, when Mao and Mayumi take a bath in her family's hot spring. Here the two are on screen naked, but importantly the tone of the scene is completely different to everything from before. Now the music is more calm, the framing less sexual, and the two characters simply talk about the mundanity of life. It's somber, though to a lesser extent than to much of the other scenes I've referenced. But in an episode spent solely being comedy-driven, the sudden change to actual full-blown uncensored fan service heralds a more serious moment in the story. We also previously spoke about how the inclusion of a see-through bra scene for Primila helped to accentuate the severity of that scene. There we saw how Rin, and by proxy the audience, don't react with arousal, but instead with embarrassment at the realization they've let the girl down. Like I said before, the scene wouldn't hit as hard without this clarity and lack of ambiguity, and so it shouldn't be surprising that this is her only nudity scene in the whole show. During Kikyou's episode 11, the date is brought to a sombering halt, going from comedy to drama when Kikyou flashes Rin and tries to proposition him with her body. As soon as she's actually presented herself openly to him, Rin, and ergo the viewer, is smacked in the face with how wrong, how messed up this situation is, to an extent doubly so for the viewer who knows Kikyou has stolen Sia's form. All this in spite of the fact that Sia is meant to be one of the our main on-to fanservice characters. The show is using the reality that nudity offers in order to hammer home the severity, or sometimes just the importance of a scene. We see it again when Keade offers herself to Rin. This scene hits with far more sincerity and desperation because she is actually on screen. Likewise, the same is appropriate with how most of Keade's nudity moments. And finally, we have what I mentioned about in episode 22. Like 11, it's full of fan service, including the sexy older sister trope, cat maid cosplay trope, and general girls fighting over the main guy activity. But throughout it all, they're never nude. Because the point of these scenes is both a further release of the rich, high-stakes tension of the previous three arcs, and as an embodiment of the faulty harem good end mentality of most harems and non-standard rom-com anime. If any of the fan service was presented with nudity, it would throw the whole thing off kilter, and it's in this way that the show not only proves that it only uses nudity for maturity, but manages to weaponize its own obscenity into something more adult. The really sad part about all this, the prominent divide that's formed in the anime community around Dragon Maid, ReZero, SAO cancel culture, and almost everything Noralities' legion of parrot-like followers champion, combined with the elitism, hate culture, and gatekeeping the anime communities have always attracted and appealed to, many will go into Shuffle, seeing its ecchi or harem tag, and immediately decide there's no value to be had. They'll dismiss the whole show because of a lolly scene or minor nudity, all because they're unwilling to look past their preconceived notions and biases about their own country's politics or about their own opinions on any given genre tag. It's a shame, to put it lightly, that one would miss out on all the depth and subtext for a silly little reason like that. Nudity in Shuffle is always used sparingly and for good reason, whether it's to accentuate the severity of a point or as a metaphor like in the advert's title card. It is constantly used to signal a change in tone or pacing to a masterful extent, and rather than degrading any scene it's included in, it instead manages to present itself as a prevailing sign of the show's, well, maturity. Hello, Nora. What's up? Hey.
Though I hold these words for you deep inside of my heart, I hope they will reach you someday.
Welcome back to the one and only, because no one else cares, Shuffle Retrospective. Episode 23, Character Analysis, Asa. If Primila forms the show's core in that her story and character journey mirror that of all the questions the other character strands each ask us as the viewer, then Asa Shigure makes up the other half of that coin. She is the show's answer to its own questions. When we look at Asa as a character, we have to understand what the point of her is, as it deviates from the others. Where they're all used to propose faults in the genre's formula and archetypes, Asa is used to illustrate a less toxic route through life. She's imperfect by any means, which is quite important. She can be rash and boyish, but she's deeply caring and has an old head on her shoulders, as it were. Her playful, almost tsundere aspects act as a front for her more muddly interior, and a deep-rooted sense of shame and regret for her past actions as a child, which in turn continue to plague her in the present day. However, all this Asa's issues are initially external, where Sia, Nerine and Keade all have a hand in their own miseries. Asa doesn't. She didn't ask to be born ill. Mind you, we will see soon that she isn't infallible to the same traps the other girls fall in, but the point to focus on is, especially early on, Asa kinda has it together. This fallibility plays heavily into what the point of Asa is, realistically. We can see this part of her portrayed all over the series. I mentioned before a great visual reference to it in episode 18, when we see her and Rin bantering, while an alternative young couple do the generic formulaic asking out scene in the background of our focused foreground. We also mentioned how in that same episode, when Asa is neglected, she doesn't swoon and look wistful, but instead she pouts. And when it reaches a boiling point, she doesn't make excuses for Rin or blame herself like some of the other girls might have, but instead slaps him and gives him a good what for lecture. In fact, our very first scene of discussion was one where we saw how much she contrasts Nerine in her apparel and cooking style, along with her sisterly tendencies to carry plasters around. And that was all the way back at the start of the essay. Even when they do finally get together, their relationship differs heavily from that of Rin with the others. They date, kiss, and talk in a casual manner. They act like old best friends, because that's what they are. A good couple is one where both parties aren't just in love, but rather one where they enjoy each other's company, feel comfortable in their intimacy, and can act naturally. When Rin is with Sia, Nerine, and Kikyou, he has to keep putting up a front, as they do. Both parties have to actively try to impress one another to make things perfect, to make them how it's supposed to be. And when he's around Keade and Primila, he has to act in the traditional image of what he perceives a man of the house to be, all playing back into his character team of societal and cultural male expectations. But with Asa, he and she genuinely look happy together, like they're having a whole lot of fun just talking or going to cafes or doing the shopping. A large part of Asa's later character is this relationship, and it's a healthy one built on mutual trust and a slow burn of bonding across the whole series run. The aspect of realism goes further. I earlier referred to Asa as keeps spoiling the plot, and that can now take on an entendre meaning, as not only does she audibly spoil elements of the story when she explains that you don't control who you fall in love with, that it's more special than that, but also is an active agent against the harem formula. To elaborate, Asa is used to discount the tropes of her story in exchange for submitting a better way forward. It's her who convinces and supports Rin in rescuing Primila, rather than just having him work it out by himself. It's her who we think will be going, or is going to be the yandere victim when Keade loses control, but instead becomes the one to partially save Keade, with just her words and hug and helps largely pulling her back into the light. But as mentioned, this realism is a double-edged sword, because in real life, even if you are pragmatic, caring, and an ultimately kind individual, a good person if you will, life isn't fair, and Asa becomes very ill. Fallibility. As we discuss episode 23 in the first half of 24, we'll experience how Asa being a real person can lead to its own form of hardships. The episode cleverly opens on a reminder of where Rin is and who he is, rather than on Asa. This will soon be used to draw parallels between his past self and his current self. He lashes out at a doctor seemingly in charge of treating Asa after the closing events of 22. His intentions are in the right place, but his actions prove extremely selfish as he puts Amma in a position of having to support both him and her daughter, when she herself is already under some great considerable strain. Remember this, it will be important. We at long last get a full account of the details involving Asa and Amma's respective backstories. The details aren't overly important by themselves, as they were guessable, but nonetheless is a good source of intrigue. What actually stands out most in this scene is the brilliant directing on display. The special effects used for the explosion really sell you on the idea that this was a truly catastrophic event, and the general directing of the flashback with its vague, dreary and dreamlike allusions to Asa's father, Amma's saviour, are visually most welcome. With this information, we better understand the nature of Asa's illness, as we can link it straight back to what we already knew about Primila's. However, it also brings to light a new question. Primila simply needed to mature as a person in order to better control her powers, but as Asa is already a fleshed-out individual, her issue comes from the fact she refuses to use said powers. In what is a truly brilliant masterstroke of an idea, the show actually turns the concept of the young heroine being the most realistic love interest into the central plot point. Asa's ambition to be, in her own words, I'm a human, just a human, are her hang-up. The episode has some other noteworthy points, slightly less tangentially to her personal story. There's a nice short scene with Keade, Primula and Kareha come to visit. It being these three is a good combination, considering two of them are Asa's best friends, and the third is essentially Asa's cousin. The scene is also great for Rin, as Kareha, along with Amma in another scene, asks Rin to think about what it is that only he can do. Imperatively, though, she doesn't tell him, or so much as give him a hint as to what that is, only that she's relying on him. It's so important that this is the case, and it continues to put the onus on Rin to make the decision that he believes is right. As you can imagine from my summary description alone, the conflict of this final arc revolves around Rin and Asa arguing over her hesitance to use her powers. We get a number of beautifully slow dialogue scenes of Rin spending time with Asa, who the animation team do a great job of gradually making look more and more decrepit, her face turning ever more pale to the point it's almost bony and malnourished. To me, this is a wonderfully alternative extreme to the yandere faces that Keade made earlier on. And like that one, this one too absolutely haunts my dreams. Asa's being what you might call selfishly altruistic. It's a team every character shares, and a general theme of the show, and while Asa manages to keep away from it for a time, we now see it finally catch up to her. Her conflict is in a way the most realistic part. Its solution is simple, just use the magic. But like is so often true in life, it's not that simple. It's funny that on occasion throughout this essay I've referred how people far too often fail to see past themselves, can have their minds narrowed by a certain sense of thinking. In Asa we're seeing this. She isn't doing this out of malice. She isn't trying to hurt Rin or Amma. She's doing what she believes is right. Grasping why Asa won't just use her magic can be really difficult, but if you've experienced people who act like this in the real world, then you can totally understand what the story's trying to say here in this particular element. Rin growing ever more desperate placates her, borderline begging her to act before it's too late. But Asa's retort is frustratingly blunt. It's my life to bet, not yours. Have you ever heard someone say something to that effect? These episodes make a brilliant job of showing us Rin's anguish. He mopes around the hospital corridors and waiting rooms, which reflect his own isolation in their barren emptiness. I find a genuinely heartbreaking scene when Asa describes her dream, one where an aged version of herself and Rin stand upon the same overlook and once more profess their feelings for one another, all while the camera stops upon a disconcerting top-down view of an empty, dusk-baited overlook. The words don't match the image of the path she's chosen to tread. Finally, we get the last piece of the puzzle, as Asa explains her motives, stating she doesn't want to use her magic in an effort not to hurt her mother any further than she already did as a child. The voice acting here by Monica Rial and animation are crushing, as your heartstrings get snapped in half. Aside from playing into the themes of her character and that of the show, it's also just a wonderful case of irony. Her actions mirror Rin's so closely. Remember that scene at the episode's open? She believes wholeheartedly that what she's doing is for the best, but in reality she's the one making her mother responsible for her own daughter's death. To loop it back around to an earlier point, were you to compare this to modern politics, it's like those who saddle their high horse in order to defend some group or minority, who never actually asked for such aid. Asa has decided on what's best for her and her mother without taking all the facts into consideration. She hasn't asked Amma what she wants. And that's a running thing. Rin doesn't ask Primila what she wants, etc. With that, we come to the end of episode 23, and with it we can now truly understand what Asa Shigure is. Her and Rin initially seem like an old-fashioned the opposites attract type couple, the introvert and the extrovert, the reliable best friend and the indecisive young boy. But in reality, they share more in common than we expect. They've both got unfounded expectations on their shoulders, both have been through a traumatic upbringing, and they are each a kind-hearted to an absolutely detrimental fault. That's part of what makes them such a great couple to each other, along with what we already discussed above. In a way, Asa's character is much simpler to talk of than the others, as her role within the narrative as a more realistic waifu means that she dispenses with much of the baggage, and that what she does have mirrors the other characters, hence we've already discussed it. As I have no intention of repeating myself, considering the absurd length of this essay already, I shan't go off on another ramble about the themes of finding your personal identity when you're only a young person, or on another rant about the topic of extreme altruism, but please don't take any of that to mean that I value Asa as a character any less than I do the other 5 primary forces of the show. No, indeed, her portrayal is one of the things that I believe makes Shuffle work so well. Not content just to criticise, it gives us a more healthy, vague guideline to contemplate and think about, with its take on the ideal healthy relationship, and then it snatches it away with what has to be one of the most realistic depictions of how crap life can be, even when you're in love. Illness or accidents, differences in opinions, or unforeseen circumstances of previous actions can all jump from nowhere to ruin everything. It's a really harsh lesson, but that's one that's important to teach, especially to a young otaku audience, and definitely if it has a happy ending. Asa as a character represents reality, represents the fallibility of us, and the importance of always getting back up on our feet no matter what life throws at us. It's about holding on to the people you love, and realising when what you're doing is hurting them the most, not helping. She's about facing reality with a head held high. Episode 24, and what is important. With all that we've just discussed and have been in general about Rin and Asa's safety kept in mind, we now find ourselves on our way to the final episode. Shuffle's finale is a favourite of mine in a medium that will, while sometimes struggles to finish satisfactory, definitely presents some stiff conversations. If you'll allow me to gush for just a moment, I love how in the end of episode 23, after a whole 20 minutes of defying anime conventions, it at last stops and tells you that it's okay to want a happy ending, that sometimes things do work out, and you can be a hero for someone that you care about. I love how masterfully it wraps up all the loose ends, how it's not afraid to be cheesy and add in the odd moment of levity, how it doesn't wholesale reject the traits that make us fall in love with these genres in the first place. To get a little ahead of myself, I love how it's a happy ending. Heck, if nothing else, I love how 10 minutes of it act as an epilogue. Now, why aren't those legally compulsory? Well, I'm unsure if it's my favourite ending of all time. Gurren Lagann, Code Geass, FMAB, Revias, the original Madoka Magica, Full Metal Panic, the TV version of Ava are all incredibly generic guesses for what some of my top 3 would probably be. I'm confident it will place in the top 10, probably right around where War in the Pocket is, were I ever to sit down and field them. With all that said, we should probably take a proper look at what we're dealing with. We start things ahead, and off the bat we have some interesting framing. Asa has got up and left the hospital. Rin is in hot pursuit, and is framed desperately searching the building for her. The presentation takes wonderful strides to dull the colours of these scenes, while also making sure to once more make use of perspective, to draw Rin as small as it is noticeable. The rooms are all empty of other people, which all adds to put an emphasis not only on Rin's hunt, but also to make him look even smaller and adds to the growing sense of desperation. There is a scene with other people, a scene, that acts as one of the many examples of Shuffle's brilliant compliance to basic writing tenets. Rather than Rin saying or monologuing something to convey his thoughts, he instead rounds a corner to what appears to be the A&E department. A trolley surrounded by emergency staff parades down the hallway, with the focus being on Rin's expression. The short couple of seconds seamlessly communicates what he's thinking and the deepest worries which he's feeling in this moment, without a single piece of explanatory or worthless dialogue being spoken. We get some shots of Asa's journey into space here and there. One in particular depicts her falling in front of a rubbish collection point. The lingering shot is her sandwiched between a discarded can in the foreground and piles of other miscellaneous rubbish bags in the background. The piece of imagery feels dark, chilling almost, and I've always inferred it one of two ways. On the one hand, it seems to be almost a homage to similar subteams in the likes of Ghost in the Shell, where the idea of a corpse of a human being comparable to garbage is a side focus of that film's amazing art direction. However, it could also be seen as a representation for Asa, Amar and all the test subjects who are failed experiments doomed to die at the hands of their own extraordinary abilities and potential. Conversely, it could just be as heartbreaking as it is eye-catching and nothing more. The rest of the city is portrayed in much the same manner as the hospital, with only a collection of uncaring machines in the form of car traffic for company. Rin and his quest seem ever smaller when framed on these sullen backgrounds. He retreats to the familiar setting of the park, and while sitting on the fountain side considers his options. This small, tiny even moment is it. This is the culmination of his arc, and I absolutely love the subtlety. It's here he decides his course of action, and here where he finally has to think about her, not about himself or what would be socially right to do, which in the moment would probably be to call the police or Amar or anyone, but instead he thinks about Asa and Asa alone, deciding what he thinks is best for her, himself and no one else. Now we come to it. This one is the last big scene we need to discuss in the whole show's run. I referenced it earlier, all the way back in episode 20, which for me writing this was some weeks ago, and for me recording this was fucking ages ago. This scene is my final favourite scene TM, and I want to preface it one last time, reiterating that I am no way qualified in any form of media study. Indeed, I'm a rank amateur in all manner of analysis regarding of the form of media and apparently talking straight, and as such I doubt my words can truly do this scene any real justice. Therefore, if it's a while since you last watched Shuffle, I advise you going back and rewatching at least this scene, up to the break title card, or just a whole episode if you want. Heck, fucking rewatch the whole thing, it's worth it. To properly reacquaint yourself with the tone and feeling of this scene. You done? Okay. After reuniting with a forlorn Asa, Rin listens calmly to her for a time. No music plays, which I love, and Rin is mostly silent to boot, as Asa, with a hollow smile, utters her devotion to the young man. There's some nice parallels to the other scenes here. Rin gives Asa his jacket, the only other case of this being Primila in episode 15. Furthermore, his eyes are obscured throughout most of the scene as he hides his true intentions, his mind already made up. I really like that you know me as well as you do, Rin. Asa's face is continually drawn in that same unnerving, ghostly fashion from the prior episode. Adding further to the sickly, sweet feel of the scene, the camera grows legs and proceeds to track much of the shots. In particular is how Asa closes the distance between herself and Rin. However, the following shots hold as Rin steps away, replacing the closeness with a new distance. The two continue to chat, their usual banter still shining true to give this tragedy some minor moments of levity. Your heart breaks some as Asa continues still to ramble onwards.
Hey, come on. Don't shortchange it. If all you can say is I guess, then it makes the confession seem like nothing. It touched me, so please don't ruin it.
I'm sorry.
I am glad that you said it, though. In fact, I'm really glad that you said it just like a proper gentleman would.
As Rin increases the aforementioned distance between the two, you soon realise then what he's doing isn't what he's been told. That would be to let her die like she asked. Nor does he leave it to Asa's mum to talk her out of this crazed course of action, which, remember, is what happens in all the other arcs. Instead, he does what he wants. He decides to save her no matter what it takes. The music at last cuts back in, but it isn't for a dramatic rescue this time. No, that was episode 15. Instead, it's much more intimate, so much smaller and yet a way bigger act in its own fashion. It's surprisingly graphic as Rin slits his wrist and presents a kind expression to his blood-stained face, while Asa all the while despairs at the scene unfolding in front of her. Personally speaking, I'm quite squeamish. In fact, just talking about this vague summary with the episode in the background makes me somewhat embarrassingly a little lightheaded. It's why there's a gaping hole in my knowledge of gory horror anime. Regardless of that, I think it's fair to say this scene shows another glimpse of the production team's fantastic breadth of skills, as the blood is in no way obscure, hammering home the severity of the scene, but also imploring its importance. This small act has its desired effect, and episode 24 and 24 episodes in, and Rin finally becomes the hero of the story. It's a redemption arc in a sense. I've already said at tedium how in each of the other arcs someone else plays a large part in saving the girls. Lycoris for Primila and Nerine, Kikyou for Sia, Primula and Asa for Keade, and while in each story Rin does take an important role, I love how in the end he does the truly heroic act in order to save the one he loves. In a sense, it's cheesy, sure. A little too romantic for sure, for some, no doubt. But the camera swooshes out as Asa's powers envelop the screen and the story draws to a close. The advertisement section ends, and we resume where we began, some approximate 540 minutes worth of screen time later, in the hallway of the Furia residence. The art style has changed once more, now being slightly more detailed and even moving at a higher frame rate in places, which sure makes for a nice touch to make it seem more flush and fluid moving. The final section of the show is its epilogue, but that doesn't mean we're done talking. No, indeed, there's some clever stuff going on here. Firstly, as suggested, we have a mirror to scene 1 in episode 1. However, Primila's pigtails swing into the frame, cueing us in that this is no recap. She also narrates this final segment, as mentioned in my analysis of her character earlier on. This epilogue is so satisfying because it takes time, as we will see, to show us each character's continued development. Primila herself helpfully clues us in that only around 3 weeks have passed, ergo the characters are definitely still working on themselves, but enough time for most of them that we can enjoy the catharsis of seeing how they've grown. Primarily on that list is Keade. She's put all her more dangerous tendencies into the role of being an older sister. However, unlike with Rin, Primula is someone who is a younger sister, rather than a surrogate daughter, is someone who she can rely on, to support her, rather than how it was with Rin. Keade was simply catering to his desires. This new setup is a marked improvement for both, as they act as good sisters should and help each other. The scene continues to repeat the same joke from the opening episode, with Keade forgetting her own lunch, though Primila's inclusion here obviously changes the scene intrinsically. A new one-off track plays over the moment, and Primila conveys the aforementioned information about the passing of 3 weeks, as well as confirming her age as just 1 year below Kaide's. We follow up with a scene reminiscent of episode 22, with the girls on their way to school, before make for a nice grouping even before Rin and Asa's entrance, and Primila continues narration, proceeds to spell out the plot for anyone who's still not paying attention.
Scolded Rin for risking his life, but honestly, I think he did what he felt was right.
She says this as a response to the news that the gang were thoroughly pissed at Rin for risking his life, which is an expected and fairly justified thing to hear. As stated, we get something akin to 22 in these last 10 minutes, essentially fan service. However, what I've always found interesting about it is how it's less fantastical than 22's effort. Where it had made outfits, lewd Kikyou and drunk dads, 24 is far more low-key. It's much more grounded, more realistic. The people involved act like a group of friends who've been through a ton of traumatic events in recent months. Sure, there's still the girls fawning over Rin, but it's far less etchy. Furthermore, rather than a party, they simply return to the rooftop get-togethers. It's also playful in a really uplifting way. For example, the visual novel character cut-ins return, not for the first time, but they always make themselves absent in the more serious parts of the story. Except this time the borders spring to life, bouncing off one another and covering over each other as the characters talk over one another. It's a nice touch and pretty damn wholesome. We get to see Iski receive a genuine rejection from each of the girls, which is both brutal and hilarious for how straight it's played. It's then followed by one last subversion, as I think it's fair to say most of us expected Mayumi and Iski to finally become an item, but instead, despite a compliment about her face, we get one more glorious beatdown of everyone's favourite resident gutter-dwelling pervert. Bam in the dirt's gun, as I've written in my notes. There's some more great comedy beats as during said roof's top lunch, Primila breaks nonchalantly. During the rooftop lunch break, Primila nonchalantly assassinates Rin with her cooking and pretends like it wasn't her elaborate plan all along, while grinning Machiavellianly all the while. It should also be noted that Nerine is absent from this scene, a further usage of the show's adherence to its own rules, and a good way to display her continued development past the confines of the group, which we'll touch on a little more in a second. Following that, we have a couple more important narrative points left to mention, as the show seamlessly ties up its remaining loose ends. Like most of Shuffle, it's simply action. Like most of Shuffle, it's a simple action. We watch as Amma walks down a street covering herself with faux confidence as she strides past the two otherworldly kings. As they pass, they mumble to one another about a woman they once knew and how they only wish that now they could apologise for what happened. Amma turns and bows. That's it. This, to me, is how all loose ends should be tied up. By like lore or something. The composition is quite nice here too. It's set in what the film Your Name called Golden Hour or Dusk, to be less romantic. As such, the song covers the all too familiar high streets in a warm glow, while in a sense being a visual metaphor for the compromise between light and dark. Rather fitting for the best friend duo of God and Demon. We get one or two instances of plot-based fan service next, with Asa presented in a frilly server's outfit at the cafe where Karaha works, as alluded to literally 24 episodes ago. Her and Rin share one last set of cute dialogues, showing how all is once more well in the world, and in what I believe is Karaha's little sister's second appearance and only line in the show, she sums up the smile these final scenes always put on my face with a brush of her own. I love a happy ending. And then it ends. We get some great custom credits, which are always a win in my book, including an exceptionally well-animated kiss between Keade and Sia, that being the other instance of fan service, and wrap up the last bit of development for Nerine. We learn earlier in the episode that she's really taking to her new pursuit of radio, and may even be going to sing on air in the near future. Like the armor ending, this is such a perfect illustration of masterfully writing an ending. After all, not only is she clearly living life for herself and enjoying it at that, but the point about singing is definitive proof that she's come to terms with the death of her sister, and has truly recovered from her survivor's guilt. Her shot in the credits shows her at Lycoris' grave. It's both nice, as she's the only character incapable of being present in the epilogue, but also another sign of Narine's progression. Prior to episode 15, I'm strongly confident she could never have faced that grave, but now she looks on it as her own person. It's also nice how it ends Shin's theory that no one would grieve the artificial lives proved false, as evidenced by this shot of Nerine at the gravesite. Neither the show ever forgot or Nerine, their big sister, which plays quite well into the theme of family. It's just a nice way to wrap things up. Long sought after conclusion. Well then, here we are, some 42,000+ words later. I've no intentions to do the whole sappy, this show changed my life spiel. However, I suppose some context is appropriate in the final act. Shuffle was not my first anime, but one of a series of recommendations from a good friend, meaning it was certainly something I watched in the first year of proper anime viewing. You know, that year when you realise anime is more than just Digimon or Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon. I loved it on that first watch, and it probably set my standards for harem and rom-com anime way too high. If you see my Mal list, you'll know I actually score most generic harems in the region of a 7. Read on Judging Anime by Jury for more information on that. But for one to get a 10, this is the standard I expect. Coming up with a summary here is tricky. We've gone through a lot, and Shuffle as a show has so many dense layers that I once more must insist that I have hardly done it justice. However, as I said at the very beginning, I've always struggled to find any good analysis for more niche shows like this one. Sure, there is some, but much of it is shallow, or people complaining that they don't like how Asa is the winner, or they hate how Rin is a pussy, which brings us back to what we discussed in the Maturity and Nudity segment. If someone has done a better analysis, please send it on to me, as I'd love to hear the thoughts of other reasonable people. But in lieu of that, let's wrap up, shall we? I've watched Shuffle more than 5 times now, and an inordinate number of time has been spent thinking about it. So much so that between that and this essay, you could probably add an extra couple of watches onto it. Ever since that first rewatch 5 years ago, I've been threatening friends and my long-suffering brother that I would actually write something about it one day. But you might still ask why, though how you got down this far would baffle me. Shuffle, for me, is the epitome of what makes anime unique. It appeals to an audience of young adults and teenagers that the West so often wants to forget exist and refuses point-blank to cater to with any sincerity. It's a visual wonder with its ocean of metaphors, literary shorthand, and show-not-tell storytelling. Combined with its frequent abusing of the art style to fascinating extent, the OST is varied and versatile, although the version I have of it on YouTube is missing a lot of the tracks, so fuck you, YouTube. It embodies the somber yet springly spirit of those visual novel soundtracks we've all come to love. The story is slow and considered. It, well, shuffles from genre to genre with ample amounts of foreshadowing, logical decisions, natural, relatable drama, and a real sense of that anime heart that so many others often look down upon shows exude. I've heard people use the term Gainax spirit to refer to Studio Gainax and trigger shows, and I can think of an alternative form of that shines through the visual novel shows of the 2000s. An honest sincerity to which they speak to their audience with, a kindness that isn't afraid to critique when needed, but is ultimately made by those people with a passion for this unique form of storytelling. I love that Shuffle is never cruel, but instead pragmatic about its characters. It doesn't try to pretend their illness, mental or otherwise, are some good romantic thing. It doesn't approve of detrimental altruism that so many wish fulfillment stories make light of, but it also takes great care to humanize these troubles, to remind its audience that it's okay not to be okay. Its messages about genre tropes and fantasy metaphors for real-world issues seem more relevant nowadays than they did 15 years ago, with a foresight one could compare to Anno's own predictions towards otaku culture back in 95's Evangelion. Speaking of which, I refer to Shuffle as the Ava of the rom-com harem genre, and I stand by that. Not quite a deconstruction, not quite a condemnation, but instead filled with themes of surprising hope and the chance of continued retribution. Not so much a subversion, but rather a show that does its trapping so well that it ends up exposing their inherent flaws. This isn't a show about condemning escapism, but instead one about reminding you that sometimes you have to wake up from the dream in order to reach an even better reality. And what better a message could you possibly try to deliver to an audience of young people in a world as painful as ours than that? As much as I'd long for it to be, this is by no means a comprehensive analysis. There really is just so much more to this silly, light-hearted anime from 2005. But I hope in these rambling pages and videos, you've come to see just why I love Shuffle, and why it is, I think, such a crime that it's an anime that was forgotten by the general community. In an era of anime where each season some new show comes along to fix the genre, whether it be the recent likes of Mushoku Tensei for isekai, Rent-a-Girlfriend for harems, or Horimiya for romance, this isn't to say I have an issue with any of those shows in particular. I think everyone would do well to look back on what came first. The age of a one-series complete show with concise and emotional storytelling that exceeds in every department may be over, as every new series intends to on dragging their stories out into multi-seasoned incomplete set to half stories, but that doesn't mean we don't have the luxury of being able to go back to the golden age. In this age of ultimate availability, we can choose to watch whatever we want at any time. Sure, there is plenty of new properties still coming out, but maybe it's time you'll stop trend chasing. Don't watch shows that you don't enjoy just so you can hate on them, but equally do give all shows a fair shot in good faith. Like Shuffle, dispense with the rhetoric, form your own opinions but be flexible within them, be tolerant and open to change. Try to understand everyone, no matter how deplorable they may seem to you. If a Japanese cartoon about cute high school girls can do it, then surely so can you. I sincerely hope you got something from this essay, and maybe Shuffle even raised in your estimation a little after it. If you got down to this video, you have my extreme and wholehearted thanks for watching, and I honestly really hope you enjoy. Best regards, Momentie.